Hey, everybody. Welcome to Squatch Talk. I'm Pat. And tonight, as you guys know, because you've seen this advertised, I'm sure, we have Dr. Jeff Meldrum with us, which pretty much everybody knows in the Bigfoot world. He's a professor at Idaho State University of anatomy and anthropology, world-class expert in foot morphology in the evolution of primates. So welcome to the show, Dr. Meldrum. Glad to have you here. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. Sorry about that truck out there. One of the reasons that I wanted to have a conversation with you and talk about some things is because of this, because of your appearance on Modern Day Debate channel on YouTube a few months ago, roughly. And that fascinated me. I mean, here we have this debate channel, they talk about, politics and religion, and creationism, and even flat earth stuff, so that's some kind of way out there stuff, but it's kind of entertaining to watch flat earth debates actually. And here comes this Bigfoot debate. And of course, what better person, than our, I'd say the Bigfoot community's sort of prized academic, real scientist, Dr. Meldrum. And so that really fascinated me that you did that. And just real quick, I'm curious, like, how did that come about? I would imagine that did James reach out to you to do that?
Oh yeah, he did. And I mean, it was couched. I sort of looked forward to it as just an opportunity for conversation. I mean, I didn't, debating is not really a method of scientific exploration per se.
Right.
But although we critically evaluate evidence, and so that was the approach I took. And he described the other participant, and oh shucks, what is it?
Maddie,
yeah.
Yep.
Science side up, and so that sounded great. She was a PhD student. She clearly was thoughtful, and this was not her first hayride on the topic of biologically related subject matter. And so, so it was fun. It was interesting. There were a few moments that were a little frustrating. I think she almost felt compelled to adopt a skeptical point of view and just to play devil's advocate for the sake of a debate.
Right.
And so sometimes, the conversation got a little strained, I guess would be the best way to say it. But other than that, I thought it was fun. It was interesting, and it's always good to, that's part of the process of peer review, is to expose your thinking to a fresh perspective, and whether it's by means of clarification or by reevaluation of your thought process and your justification of the conclusions that you've drawn. And so it's always a healthy exercise. And you've got to you don't take these kinds of things personally ever, unless there are ad hominem attacks, but that's one of the things that you're trained at a very early stage in your career as a budding scientist, as a student and budding scientist, is to somewhat detach yourself from your hypothesis, so that criticism of the hypothesis isn't taken as a personal attack. And I mean, sometimes people behave in such a way that it merits the criticism of themselves rather than just their thinking. But
well, we are people.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah. Right. But you can be trained to be more objective, or and things like that. And critical thinking is a part of that training. But sure. I would say mission accomplished. That you said you had the idea of going into it to have more of a conversation,
Right.
and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And that's what fascinated me, to be honest with you. Here you are on a debate channel, and of course, Maddie. Maddie was she's a good. You can tell she's a good scientist. She's a good-hearted person. Like so she wasn't coming there to be adversarial.
Well,
Like,
right. That shouldn't be the goal either. I think
right.
It should. It's sometimes, when you're engaging skeptics with a capital S,
Yeah.
logical skeptics who doubt everything from the outset, that it becomes sometimes an adversarial. Not always, but sometimes there are some individuals who are, I think, well known to the community.
Yeah, and I think those people truly close-minded.
Well, yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
Their starting point is, it's like, I've often used this example, and maybe ad nauseum, but the colleague who, not to my face, but in response to my request for justification for the rejection of a paper that had been solicited by the editor, but had been squashed by his advisory panel.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked for justification. It came back, and he said, well, the spokesperson, the person that was the most outspoken, said they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence he thinks he has. And so when that's your starting point, you've already made up your mind. You have these preconceptions, and I don't want to be bothered with evidence.
Yeah.
Where does that go? I mean,
it goes nowhere, Dr. Meldrum. And again, I'll say this: that to me, that's being truly closed-minded.
Right.
Whereas an open-minded person is not. Sometimes people mistake that as like they'll believe anything, like they're gullible. Sure. It's being open-minded is a willingness to consider new ideas.
Right.
It's pretty much that simple.
Sure.
So that's kind of how science works. Yeah. So I found it. That debate had a very special impact on me. It really touched me, and it kind of made a light bulb go off on my head. And I really truly thought to myself, I want to do that. I want to have an outreach. Like, I think it's important to go to scientific professionals in any capacity that I can. And it's just me. I'm just, Pat Turner. And, but I could do it. And sure enough, I reached out and I got to have that same conversation on a different debate channel with Erica, who's a primatologist and anthropologist, who was the co-moderator on that debate that you were on Modern Day Debate Channel.
Okay.
Yeah. So I got to do the same thing. So it inspired me to do the exact same thing. And it went great in a different way, because I'm not an academic, I'm not a scientist. But it really did. It inspired me. So I think that that's an important thing. And you were telling me just before we went on air that now you're doing things outside of the Bigfoot world with even like younger people, younger generation, even kids.
Oh yeah.
Where you're at different places talking about the Bigfoot phenomena.
All right. There's such a huge interest, and it's such a great hook for students, young and old. And so, yeah, and it seems to have picked up pace during the pandemic as people have become much more familiar with the potential of Zoom and other platforms to hold these virtual meetings. And so, but for quite some time, I've been, invited to grade school classrooms, and which is always fun because I can take a lot of hands-on models of bones and skulls and footprints and skeletons and so on, but right on up to university settings, campus-wide or particular classroom presentation, be it in
Really?
anthropology or philosophy. Critical thinking is always a real hot topic. Persuasive speeches. You don't know how many times I get tapped by college students for a brief interview as part of their persuasive argument project for a speech class. And so it's always fun. It's fun to promote the curiosity as well as the critical thinking. But
I see. I find that fascinating, and again, it just like I just told you before we went on air that like I had no idea. I had no idea you were doing that. Like you've been kind of busy in the Bigfoot world lately.
Yeah.
So so if you're doing that, so you're going outside the Bigfoot world in all these different kind of like places and different diverse, capacities, and you're actually talking about Bigfoot in the way that you do. That's exactly that. I mean, that's just exactly what I'm talking about when I say, I was inspired by your modern day debate, and it made me want to reach out into the scientific community and show them that there's an element to this phenomena and the people that follow it and maybe swim in those waters that isn't what you think. We have critical thinkers, we have skeptics, we have objectivity, we have all those tools, but yet here we are scratching our heads about the phenomena, but we're not, academics like yourself. So this group exists, this kind of element to the Bigfoot world exists where, and I know, this is that, you might get a colleague interested and they just kind of blow it up like, well, I mean, I've seen those guys on TV. They don't seem well educated.
Right. Well, that can be a challenge. I mean, the quote Bigfoot community is such a diverse cross section of humanity, and there's all types, and many bring very laudable skills, admirable skills and talents to bear, whether it's wildlife photography or bioacoustics or all sorts of things, tracking skills,
trackers,
and it's a case in point. I mean, I've always kind of advocated this notion of citizen science, and the motivation behind writing the field guide was to create a kind of how-to opportunity. And but something I just did recently, I'm frequently the recipient of photos of footprints or casts or handprints in the handprints on car windows that have been highlighted by the dust that adheres to the oils from the hand. And a lot of them don't yield likely or informative data about Sasquatch. But I always take the time to kind of walk the person through the process of evaluation. I try to generate some little diagrams to show the interpretation of a footprint or a fingerprint and so forth. And and just the other day, I realized, well, I've missed an opportunity to share that exercise with a wider audience than just this one-on-one dialogue. And so, anonymously, without giving anyone's name or location or whatnot, I just recently posted on my Facebook page some of those interpretations, a couple of them. And I'll have to go back through and cull some from my email inbox, but to share them with a broader audience and hopefully, instill some skills or some critical interpretation abilities in those folks out there who then can be citizen scientists. And because there's a lot. It's so easy to overinterpret or misinterpret outright the evidence that one finds out there in the field, and it comes with some experience, and so the more examples I think that are presented and afforded the opportunity to bounce around and comment upon, the better off we'll all be as a community. So I think it'll be kind of fun and interesting to share those things with a wider viewership.
Yeah, I agree. And believe it or not, I mean, there are people in the Bigfoot world that think and promote just like you said. Don't misinterpret a bear double step. Not everything you see in the woods is Bigfoot. There are people that go out in the woods. There's a whole community of people that go out in the woods and build primitive structures. Not every hair,
right,
pile of dung you see. But it is you're in a very unique position, because you're a beacon of sorts, as far as like, you're the first person people think of whenever they find something they think is interesting, and they immediately want to tug on your shirt about it. And as a good example, is it true that you actually do receive poop through the mail?
Not recently, but in the past, because I've had enough opportunities like this to kind of discourage people from indiscriminately shipping that kind of material through the postal services. But there was a time, yes, when it happened more frequently than desirable under conditions that were not, that's not something to ship in the heat of August, when it may sit in the mailroom down on main campus for a couple of days before it's brought up here to our our office. And so yeah, no, I do get a lot of that, and by no means do I want to discourage. You say a beacon or lightning rod. It's I think it's just because I have become the face, the academic face of this subject. There are others, and we've lost a few, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's true.
But I would also encourage, and not to discourage people from sharing with me. You can CC me, but I would encourage you to search out your local authorities, be it Park Service, and I know some people are, because some have shared their interactions, and I've actually been referred to and have had the opportunity to have conversations with some of these local park rangers or university professors in anthropology or biology, or zoo people. But if you can, there are more people out there, academics and otherwise, that have an interest, that harbor an interest, even if it's a closet interest, because in many situations, as I've discussed quite openly in public, you're going to get tarred and feathered in some situations.
And that's unfortunate, of course. Thank God you have tenure. That's all I have to say.
Well, see, as I've said, I was naive or idealistic enough that I didn't think that should be the basis for making a decision whether to pursue something intellectually or not.
I agree.
As a result, I got beat up pretty soundly. That's maybe overstating it, but I took a lot of flack.
I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have. And I get that. Even though I don't hang out in the scientific community a whole lot, I just intellectually, instinctively, I'll say, get that. Because again, people are people, man.
But just to finish that thought, the thing that I wanted to emphasize, though, that is, if investigators out there, enthusiasts, will cultivate those local connections, I think, one, they'll be pleasantly surprised because there is a lot of interest, and two, it gives these other folks that are kind of in the closet, an opportunity to engage and interact with the evidence and with people who are interested, and sincere, genuine about their efforts to look for evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it just ups the game a bit, when you have more participation by these folks. And I think, I really think we're on the cusp. I've talked about this, that citing, Thomas Kuhn, who's his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He was the fellow who coined the term paradigm shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked about how we've been experiencing a paradigm shift when it comes to the theoretical context for considering even the question of the existence of relic hominoids.
I agree, and I would reference immediately my debate, with Erica, which again was not a debate.
Uh-huh.
It was a curious conversation, even though she challenged me on some things.
Yes.
And it would be interesting to actually bring up a couple of those challenges, because she kept trying to drag me into how do they evolve to this, and I'm like, I don't know. That's above my pay grade.
Yeah.
But
those are straightforward questions. I mean, those are questions with straightforward answers. I mean, as far as theoretical, we certainly can't talk conclusively about those questions, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, the biggest point she made, I conceded the point, is that primates evolved through, as savanna dwellers, and they're bipedal savanna dwellers. So how could they do so well in all this terrain all of a sudden?
There's some.
I was like, I don't know.
There's some old school thinking there. First of all,
but she's a young.
Well, yeah, I know.
Scientist.
The sources. No, that the idea that humans evolved bipedalism to forge out into the open savanna and brave the lions and hyenas and leopards. Oh my, that's an old just so narrative. All the evidence points to bipedalism having evolved in woodland habitats, and upright posture was probably predisposed from vertical postures in the canopy, climbing up tree trunks, hanging under tree trunks, reaching overhead to harvest resources. I mean, there's all sorts of contextual aspects of that
and time
problematic
and time.
Sure.
I've come to since then, she kind of caught me off guard, because I'm like, again, I'm not an academic, but
sure.
I mean, I know some things. I can talk about Giganto, but I'm like, well, we're talking over the past 4 million years. There's time for evolution in that, right? So
sure, and evolution can occur very rapidly. I mean, we have our fossil record, especially of hominins, has long periods of stasis where there was very little change, and when the change occurred, a lot of it occurred fairly rapidly, as whether it was through dramatic environmental changes or bottlenecks in population genetics and so forth. So yeah, there's and this is one of my criticisms of those who adopt a quote skeptical posture, is that they get bogged, and I'm not labeling Erica as such, but it just sort of points that direction.
No, she's quite curious, actually.
Sure, yeah. But you get bogged down in these hypotheticals that we don't have good parameters really established, to the exclusion of it, and ignoring all of the evidence that exists. I've had this I spoke, we were talking about speaking in different venues. I was invited to speak to an anthropology class at the University of Wyoming, and it also included a campus-wide presentation. And afterward, we had dinner with some members of the department, including a couple of grad students. And it was interesting because a couple of grad students, they were flexing their intellectual muscles and trying to take me on and so forth. And but the department chairman he kind of came at me. He'd asked the question, during the Q&A. Anyway, but I guess I turned to him and I said, so was my answer? I said, I wasn't sure if my answer was satisfying. You know, the expression, your body language suggests that it wasn't. He says, no, it wasn't. And then he went off on this thing about the absence. He was focused on the absence of X, Y, or Z. And I said, well, after I addressed it and offered an answer, it was one of those things where you can't offer a entirely substantive answer. You have to answer kind of hypothetically or actually apologetically, but from a rational framework. And then I said, though, you skeptics, you that adopt a skeptical posture, you have your favorite missing piece of evidence, and you pound and pick and niggle away at that to the exclusion of everything else. And he goes, oh, what are you referring to? What other evidence do you have? And I said, well, weren't you sitting there in my presentation? I mean, I went through a whole list of things and so on. And I said, but probably at the top of that list for me, because of my background, it's the footprint, the composite summation of the footprint evidence that's accumulated over the past half century. And he goes, oh, well, I'm not an expert in footprints. And I just I am. So why don't you give a little deference, just as I would give deference to your ideas about forensic archaeology? Why don't you give me a little professional deference for my time and tenure as an expert in foot morphology? And so the tenure or the tone of the conversation shifted a little bit after that, because the point was made. But it's just it's funny. It's just funny.
Well, that's a little
Oh. From yourself or from me?
I think it's my voice coming through your computer.
Oh, is that what?
Yeah.
Well, I've got my speakers back behind, but usually we don't have a problem.
Okay, I just took my earbuds out.
Okay. They started off great, but then there was a little period.
So I don't hear it anymore. So I'll just go like this for a minute. Where were we at? That guy. So you were able to end up having a better conversation with him after that sort of experience?
A little bit. Yeah, I mean, there wasn't so much of the jousting. I mean, this the graduate student, he tried several times to cite this work or that work, and his understanding of the things he was citing was undeveloped. Let's put it that way. He didn't have the depth of experience to place those things in context, and so I very politely kind of pointed out, well, just because you see it in print doesn't mean it's true. I mean, that's the thing. I often point to these studies. I mean, they're specifically targeting biomedical research, because that's the purpose of there's been a series of studies where they take the literature in the biomedical field and they kind of go back for the past 20 years and how many of those papers were on the mark, or how many of them were refuted through subsequent research. And the percentage is just uncanny. I mean, it's well more than half of the papers. You might as well just, put a match to them. They're worthless. I mean, they're not worthless from a historical perspective, but the conclusions essentially are invalidated by subsequent, more extensive testing and research. So the point being that just because you see something, first, things are very time sensitive, but just because you see it in print doesn't make it true, Virginia. To make an allusion there. Some won't recognize that, but yes, Virginia, there is a Bigfoot.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the scientific journal process is vigorous, and you're right. I mean, it's there for a reason.
Sure.
Sure. And some things get latched onto and vetted better, and it becomes promising. Some things get thrown out after a year.
That's right. Oh yeah. Yeah.
That's why it's
Right.
there.
Peer review is not perfect. It's
Right.
not. It's a living. The scientific literature is kind of a living, breathing organism in a way, and so it has its foibles and it has its ups and downs. It isn't a perfectly homeostatic environment.
Mhm.
There's adjustments, and so
I
uh,
agree, and I think that's a misconception on the sort of general public's part.
sure,
People that have no knowledge of that.
yeah,
You know, they, science isn't formed on consensus. They don't.
right,
We don't take a vote and go, 51% says
yeah,
the Earth is round,
yeah,
therefore the Earth is round. The consistent consensus doesn't create reality. So.
right, and especially when the consensus is a consensus of opinion. And but we if the overwhelming message or central theme of evidence continues to reiterate a certain concept, then the consensus of data, when we're talking about data, then you can maybe employ that phrase. But yeah, it's not cut and dry. Everything's not black and white. It's a process. Science remains tentative in the face of ongoing discovery. So I don't want to leave your audience with the notion that I'm cynical about science. I mean,
Right.
there's always a certain level for someone who's reached has got as much gray hair as I do and put in the time. There's a certain level of pragmatism, I guess, maybe put it that way. I haven't quite slipped over into total cynicism, but there's a pragmatism that recognizes the process and that it is not a perfect process. And so, but you
Yeah.
have to work within the system, because that way there is at least some regimentation, some there are rails
Yeah.
that can kind
Right.
of keep things moving. But sometimes it can be too confining. That's the thing. And
Balance. Yep.
yeah, I mean, there's such a history of discoveries where things have gone off the rails, and oh wow, look what's over here that we weren't even contemplating. And so you have to always remember, that's why history is so important. That's why it's so discouraging to see such a poor grasp of general history, let alone scientific history amongst the populace, even amongst students. I mean, the 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 volume of information that students are expected to get a handle on. I I teach human anatomy and physiology, introductory textbook. Look at the thickness of the text. It's
Yeah.
there's you wouldn't think so with something like anatomy and physiology, that there would be that much different, and anatomy not much, so much more, although our understanding of the finer details of structure and organization from molecular to systems is refining.
Mhm.
But but with that level of expectation, corners get cut. And unfortunately, one of the corners that almost always gets cut, I mean, when I took classes, it was very common to spend the first week of a scientific topic looking at the history of that discipline and some
Mhm.
of the landmark studies and discoveries that have defined the scope and the objectives and the paradigms of that particular discipline. And unfortunately, that's rarely the case anymore. And unfortunately, and it's sad, because I think students benefit tremendously uh, from the inclusion of that kind of conversation, that sort of perspective.
Yeah, and I think a great example of what you just said is and of course I've heard you say this several times, and we could touch on it, is that I forget his name. I'm sorry, forgive me. Uh, but when it came to uh, the well, it looks like an ape patty. Looks
Oh,
like an
yes.
ape from the waist up,
Yeah.
but looks like a human from the waist down.
John
And
Napier.
if only been a few more years until we discovered Lucy.
Right.
How and who am I talking about? I forget the name.
Dr. John Napier.
Napier, yes.
Yeah, that's such a dramatic example. I mean, it's just like I said, it's one of my favorites because it's so ironic in a way that that was the one linchpin for him in his evaluation of the PG film, and yet that has become sort of the generic description of Australopithecines now. Half and half, this mosaicism, which is such so prevalent. It's like, hominins now. It's kind of like a game of Yahtzee. Let's see how many combinations you can get by rolling those dice. And one dice for the feet, one dice for the knees, one dice for the hips, and so on. And unexpected combinations of this Homo naledi is another fascinating example of a strange mosaicism in a species that has now been recognized to have persisted alongside other hominins, including us, for quite a length of time, much more recently than would have been imagined when the fossils were first discovered, because of some of the primitive aspects of the skeleton. And so, there's just it's like I say, you with 2020 hindsight now, that comes with the maturation of a discipline, and with the aging of the maturation of the investigators, you can look back and you can see how so many things about Sasquatch that were being described back in the 50s and 60s and 70s actually anticipated what we now understand about hominin evolution. And you wouldn't have just intuitively included some of those descriptions. They seemed counterintuitive, and if you were informed about the paradigms of anthropology at that time, you would have all the more avoided those things, because they cut right against the grain of what was consensus, what was accepted as the general notion of how human evolution had proceeded. And so that's fascinating to me. I mean,
you always make that point very well, because you would know, and you do make that point well about when, the Patterson-Gimlin film came out back in that time. So say that, shortly after it was filmed, for several years even, all the professionals basically looked at it only from one angle. Well, it can't exist because of their understanding at the time of hominid evolution, which is, well, you can't have two bipedal competitors and the hair on the breasts and walk like a man and all that stuff. You make that case very well. And I think there's something to be said for that. And now things have shifted, because, like I referred to Erica earlier, she admits fully, as a primatologist, anthropologist, she says it's a very strange film. So that's different. That's different than the old guard, let's say, from back in the 60s. She admits it's a strange film, to the point where she says the joints aren't in the right place.
Right place they aren't in the right place for it to be a man in a fursuit.
Right.
But they're in the right place for Patty.
Right. That's what I meant. The joints aren't in the right place for a hoax. But then she's like, that's not enough to convince me that there's a undiscovered upright walking hominid in North America. So,
and that's the point. Here's a quick story. Benjamin Radford, who is one of those skeptics with the capital S, nice guy though. We always have a very affable exchange whenever we bump into each other in our comings and goings. But he was invited to speak on campus, and it was sponsored by the physics department, and it was mostly for the physical scientists. But I wanted to be the fly on the wall and to hear what he had to say, and I was hoping that he was going to be speaking about critical thinking and pseudoscience and so forth, and in the broadest of terms. It wasn't supposed to be a Sasquatch talk, but coming to the ISU campus, where I'm a fixture, he couldn't resist, I guess, and constantly he kept foisting Bigfoot as the straw man, the punching bag to beat up on as examples of the pseudoscience and bad journalism and blah blah blah. And so at the very end, I sat on my hands through the question and answer period, and I wasn't going to say anything or to detract or to distract or in any way, but I finally couldn't, and I raised my hand, and the guy with the mic came back, and I said, well, it's very interesting. You have laid out this argument of criticism against bad, shoddy scientific journalism, and yet your presentation, as you criticize these other things like Bigfoot, you exhibited all of the things you were critical of. You cherry picked. You employed ad hominem attacks. You all these different techniques. I said, I said, what? But just to boil it down, I said, what would you deem to be evidence worthy of consideration? And he kind of thought for just a second. He says, well, you have to have a body. And I said, well, no, I said, that isn't evidence any longer. I mean, in the sense of suggestive evidence, that's conclusive evidence. I didn't ask you what would prove the existence of Sasquatch. I asked you, what evidence do you think would be worthy of a scientific consideration? See, that's the problem. Yeah. Is they're back here, and they're proposing that you have to jump to here.
I agree.
And they're stepping over the top of all of the intermediate steps. And that I've seen happen or repeated time and time again. And that's a real flaw in their thinking. Quite frankly, that's a flaw in their thinking.
I agree. That you're right. That is a flaw in their thinking. But I don't think I don't think that flaw exists in the entire thinking.
Oh no.
There's definitely going to be There's definitely elements. And to be honest with you, Dr. Meldrum, I'm trying to figure out how to bridge that gap. I really, truly am.
And I, at every opportunity I have, I try to emphasize, I'm not proselytizing. I'm not seeking converts to the cause here. I mean, to a position.
Yeah, belief. This is not a cherished belief.
Right. I said, all I'm doing is presenting evidence. It may seem like I'm more ardent, I'm more strident in that presentation out of frustration sometimes for the lack of objectivity and curiosity amongst some of my colleagues and some of my detractors, and so forth, or of the topic detractors. But no, I'm not. I'm simply saying, look, here's this remarkable evidence that you're just blown away because it, quote, can't exist, right? And so I'm just trying to create a venue that allows for the dissemination and the discussion and the evaluation. See, that's one of the things that's been so gratifying about the online journal that I edit, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, is, it's a pretty narrow focus, and it's got a restricted stream of submissions, as you might expect. But in the process of seeking reviewers for book reviews or reviewing manuscripts or comments or editorials, serving on the editorial board, I'm able to pull in people who aren't primarily engaged in this topic, who even would probably demur from engaging it in public. But as an anonymous reviewer, or even someone who after they read the paper, they go, this is kind of interesting. I say, well, would you be willing to write a comment and share some of your thoughts and reactions? And they say, yeah, sure. And there's only been one time in almost 10 years now that I've had a reviewer turn me down because they thought that it was shoddy or silly or wasn't worth their time. I shoot high for reviewers, so sometimes I bump into they're just too busy. One of the comments, the guy said, hey, this looks really interesting, but I've got 3 other papers that I'm under the gun to get reviewed for other journals, 3 other manuscripts. So that kind of thing. But only once did someone write back and say, no, I wouldn't, had some unkind things to say about it. Typically, they're very engaged. They find it very interesting, and welcome the opportunity to interact on that level. So,
well, that's great.
That's what I'm after. That's what I'm all about.
Get going. Yeah, and me too. If you haven't noticed,
sure. Yeah,
I'm all about dialogue. And again, I couldn't be any more different than you. Be like complimentary, I would say.
Sure.
I'm just, I'm not academic. I'm just a blue collar guy. I'm a thinker, and dialogue's everything. Discussion's everything. And again, I'll just remind I'm so glad you participated in the modern day debate.
Sure.
Because that really inspired me to get to reach outside the Bigfoot world.
Yeah.
I mean, in the Bigfoot world, just kind of preaching to the choir.
Sure.
And
sure.
A lot of the choir wants to disagree with you and go straight to this, that, or the other, right?
Yeah. 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 And it's not just an either or. It is or it isn't. It is, but it's not at all what you think it is. It's right. This, or it's this, or it's this, or it's this.
It gets convoluted pretty quick. We can both admit, the Bigfoot world could be a very tribal place. But we here at Watch Talk, we try and keep grounded in reality as far as at least a good starting point. So yeah, at this point, Dr. Meldrum, I'm going to shift gears a little bit on you.
Okay.
I'm gonna throw the panel into the mix, and they're gonna ask you some questions, and
sure.
So we're just gonna keep this kind of discussion going, just with different people.
Sure.
With that, I'm gonna bring in the panel. Bam, bam. All right. So,
how you doing?
Joining us.
Hello.
With us tonight is Ernie, Patrick, and Steve. And I'm just gonna switch gears here, man. Turn it right over to Ernie. How you doing tonight? Welcome to the show. You're live with Dr. Jeff Meldrum.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Meldrum.
My pleasure.
If I may, I just something I had just been dying to ask you, wishing I had the ability to ask you this. I watched a presentation on YouTube that Dr. John Mayachinsky gave several years ago. I think it's called the Yakima Sunday Bigfoot Roundup. It was at a Bigfoot conference. And in his presentation at one point, he has behind him a very large screen sort of slideshow presentation. And one of the things he touched on was how many wildlife professionals and or outdoor related professions of people had come to him, and I think he said, and you, when he and you collaborated some in research, and that confided in you. And there are 2 big columns of every profession that you could think of with outdoor knowledge of wildlife, from forest ranger to timber cruiser and everything in between. And I wondered if there was any way that you could comment on that, because he said that many people with those types of credentials had come to you guys, and in order to told you that with anonymity,
Sure.
And I just wondered if you could comment on that, because I think, credible people like that, their testimony is just, it's almost as if you could say to a skeptic or a naysayer, how do you explain this? How do you explain this group, this category of people and their testimony?
Yes, it's very true. I just as a preface, one time I was on a phone interview, and there was a caller, and the caller was trying to take me to task. He cited the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who's known for her work on memory and the challenges of eyewitness testimony and or regressed memory.
Yeah.
And basically, he was arguing that on the basis of her work, memory is just completely unreliable, that eyewitness testimony should just be thrown out. You can't use it for anything. And we had our little kind of back and forth, and I said, well, I think you're comparing apples and oranges. I said, the scenario of, say, a little old lady whose purse was snatched from her standing in front of a lineup of suspects, that's very different than someone from one of those columns you mentioned trying to pick out from a lineup that consists of a bear, a moose, a wolf, a Bigfoot, the backpacker. And he wasn't having it. It was so funny, though, because just to take it just a little further, he went full circle, 360 in the conversation. The moderator kind of let him, try to run roughshod over me, and in the end, though, he kept getting frustrated. I kept, parrying his swipes at me and so on, and he said, if there was an 800-pound gorilla out there, people would be seeing it. And I said, yeah. I said, well, wait a minute. That's where we started.
We're trying to tell you. Yeah.
Exactly. And I said, but you're disavowing all this testimony. And so that's one of the things about those columns is these are people who either spend an inordinate amount of time recreating, or they make a living out there in the field, and they're very familiar with the wildlife that make up that landscape. And when they have an encounter that impresses them sufficiently that they're willing to go out of their sphere of comfort and share it with someone who has, displayed enough discerning discretion and genuineness, that they have confidence that their story won't be laughed at. That's worth something. That's like I said, the contrast between the little old lady and the experienced outdoorsman. So in John's sphere, John is a professional wildlife consultant and has worked for the Game and Fish for many, many years, and then became a private consultant and does contract work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and State Game and Fish and the University of Wyoming. And so he's interacting with these people, with biologists and archaeologists and agency personnel and members of the tribe and so forth, and that adds an even additional layer of perspective. You're right. Their testimony is worthwhile, and they're not always. I often think back to a conversation I had with a hunter, and he was he felt compelled to share this with me and to look me up. But he said, I saw this thing. He said it must have been a bear, but it didn't have a snout. But it must have been a bear. But it got up and it walked away on two legs. I've never seen a bear do that. But it must have been a bear. He was trying to convince himself this had to be a bear. That's the only thing that made sense in his world. And yet it just wouldn't fit. Couldn't get that square peg in the round hole.
That square peg in the round hole, Dr. Meldrum, which is the exact opposite of, it's misidentification of a bear.
Right.
Actually, no, I'm trying to make my mind think I saw a bear. It's
Right.
completely different psychological
Yeah.
aspect of that. Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, great question, Ernie, and boy,
And
you
it's
know,
okay. Well, and if I'd like to, Jack, and get one more tag here on something you mentioned when naysayers want to bring up the fallibility factor in eyewitness testimony as being some sort of statistical proof to demonstrate that alleged Bigfoot eyewitnesses must be mistaken. What they're missing is they're not even applying the right scenario for the analogy, because the little old lady doesn't misidentify the species of her attacker.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and that's kind of like what you were laying out. It's like they can't even come. It's not even a fair analogy to try to make an argument to begin with.
Right.
You know.
I agree.
So yeah, I wish more Bigfooters could sort of kind of shut down those alleged statistics that are going to prove everything for the naysayers, because they're really just empty. They don't really even apply.
Well, and I'd refer you to
So there.
I'd refer you to the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. We just published not too long ago a paper which evaluated a large data set of eyewitness testimony. And one of the authors is a psychologist, and was down at the University of Arizona. Was a former colleague of Richard Greenwell's. And I actually wrote a comment to go along with the comments of several others on that article. But I'm sorry, no, I got that wrong. The article was actually published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. They opted for that route rather than through the RHI, and that's why I got to write the comment. But what really struck me, in addition to the interesting patterns that they drew attention to and all, was they had researched, and just in the past 20 years, there have been a couple of investigators who, reacting to Elizabeth Loftus's legacy, have done a lot more research on memory, and actually have almost done a 180, where they argue from the point of research data and clinical cases that memory is actually quite reliable under certain circumstances. That yes, that it is malleable, it is reconstructive, it can be influenced. There are these other factors involved in it, but still, studies have now shown that eyewitnesses are actually pretty reliable about certain fundamental aspects. And certainly, an encounter with an 8 foot tall hairy biped,
yeah, 4 foot wide shoulder, yeah,
under that category.
Yeah.
That is what it is.
And so it's a great paper. So the Journal of Scientific Exploration, it'd be worth taking a look at, if just to get familiar with the new literature that's out there.
Absolutely. All right, hey, let's move on.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Patrick Vaughn to the stream. What do you got for Dr. Meldrum tonight?
For being a skeptic with a capital S, that was me. And that was changed with a couple of encounters. I can honestly say that I completely understand disbelief of the target species and the perception of it, because I was so hardwired and trained that these things do not exist, that it literally took me 3 encounters to be able to wrap my head around, okay, this is a real thing. I went from they don't exist, they never did, to there's a phenomenon out there that will make you believe there's a Bigfoot, to a 3rd encounter of, okay, we need to get in the truck and leave because it's real. Yeah. So I don't really have a question. I just wanted to make that statement. I understand disbelief.
Right. Well, I've had many an experience with individuals who, to start off with, I had a past department chairman, the one who actually hired me, And he was not, when I went down this path, he was not happy at all with this turn of events. And at every opportunity, he made that quite clear, either to me or to my fellow colleagues in the department behind my back. And one of the statements that was came back to me that he made to another member of the department was, "I was born and raised in Idaho. I've hunted and fished all across the state. If there was something like this out there, I would have seen it." And I have heard from other people a similar sentiment, but then follow up just as you did.
Yep.
Where they say, if it was out there, I would have seen it. But just last year, you'll never believe what happened. and that's all it takes. Is that, I mean, that's the one thing that people forget, I think, or don't quite have a sense of, is the rarity. You know, when they see tables and they see maps with pins all over them, they think, or they have their favorite documentary states, Bigfoot's been reported from every state in the union. You know, they're literally across the map. They think that you should, if they actually exist, like this fellow who said, if there's an 800-pound gorilla out there, people would be seeing it. Well, they do, but they see it very infrequently, very surreptitiously, and by serendipity. Over the word homonyms there, but you know, people like me that go out and spend all this time in the field rarely have any kind of success at finding trace evidence, let alone a visual encounter. And almost all the credible reports out there are encounters by chance. They're purely by luck. And so yeah, it's a rare event. And you know, you say, well, no one wins the lottery. You know, I've bought tickets all my life and I've never won. Well, there's a whole list of people who have won. You know, but it just doesn't happen very often.
Well, it took until I was 30 years old. My grandfather, I'm a third generation tracker. Okay. My grandfather was a tracker. My father was a tracker. I'm a primitive living skills instructor and tracker. And it took me till 30. It took me till 30 years old and using those skill sets into going into areas that people don't usually go into. That's where I run into something that shouldn't exist.
Right.
And it was, I can understand how I can show someone a deer track and it's a deer track. They accept that. And I can show someone a hog track and it's the same. They can accept that. I can show someone a Sasquatch track or a handprint that doesn't exist.
Right.
I understand that. It's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate wiring of our minds.
Right.
But yeah, I understand it.
Yeah. That's great.
All right. Good job. Steve, what do you have for Dr. Meldrum tonight?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks. In December of 2019, the Friday before Christmas, I sent an email with a half a dozen questions about DNA. You aimed me at Dr. Haskell Hart.
Yes. Okay, good.
And I'd really like to thank you for that. I learned a whole lot from that, and that probably helped to light the fire under his chair to get that book done.
Well, good. Yeah, that's a great read, and it's a must read for people who have been subject to some disinformation, unfortunately. So it sets the record straight, and it's a great primer. I mean, I was really glad to see that he wrote it in such a way that even people who don't have the background in DNA analyses can get a handle on it sufficiently that they can, you know, make their way through his book and see the arguments and see the shortcomings of the claims to the contrary. So worthwhile.
Yeah. So I have a question. Now, I go back and forth on the Patty film. Most of the time, I'm convinced it's pretty straightforward. Mm-hmm. There is one thing that kind of sits on my head with this, and I was reminded of this by a question someone asked me. So if Patty is a female, most large primates don't have a sagittal crest. Do you have any thoughts on the sagittal crest?
Right. Well, first off, the dichotomy, the simplistic dichotomy that males have sagittal crests and females don't amongst the primates is oversimplified. It's not. There is a gender element. I mean, the male body responding to higher levels of testosterone produces some secondary skeletal characteristics, including the sagittal crest, that are more prominently developed. But it's also a functional aspect. I mean, the reason for a crest, the reason we don't have a crest, is because we've got plenty of real estate up here for our very rudimentary temporalis muscles. They have plenty of room to attach on this large area, and since they become very small. In an animal that has a small brain, there's a much more limited surface area, and with more massive muscles, in order to provide additional area, these ridges, these crests, are thrown up. So if you look at very large, in cases where there are very large female gorillas, there are cases. I've had this conversation with Esteban Sarmiento, that most people will recognize that name, who has spent a lot of time with the great apes in the field and in the laboratory. And he concurs, and I've got examples. I mean, I've posted examples before, pulled from my bookshelf, that show females with a sagittal crest that are quite large. Anyway, so if that's the case, then if you go to the size of a Sasquatch, the females far exceed the dimensions of a male gorilla, and yet their brain has not is on par proportionately with that of a gorilla, if not maybe a little bit bigger. Then there would be conceivably the need for a sagittal crest, even if you're a female like Patty. Now, having said that, going back to the film, it's not exactly clear just to what extent Patty actually shows a crest. She clearly has no frontal bone arising from the level of the brow. It slopes back rather decidedly from her heavy brow over her eyes, and it's higher. Her skull is higher in the back than in the front, which suggests that maybe it seems to. Let me rephrase that. It appears that her head is higher in the back than at the front. I'm not sure if it's her skull or not. And there have been some people who commented it almost appears that her hair is kind of standing up in a shock as she's walking. Whether it's probably not the bouncing, because she has such a smooth gait. She's not bobbing like we do on our extended support limbs. But primates often have a more developed what we call piloerection, the hair standing up on end in order to make them look bigger. If you ever see an agitated chimpanzee, for example, you know, that 3-inch hair, it stands up like it's full of static electricity. And it makes them look big. Exactly. Makes them look big. I mean, your dog does it to a lesser degree. You know, if
Razorback is what we call it.
Exactly. The ridgeback or whatever, you know, the bristles. Or, you know, we've got little shelties, and when they get agitated out in the front yard, you know, boy, their tail sticks up and the hair on their tails just stands up on completely on end. And so anyway, so that's the other possibility. There could be either of those. So, you know, again, I just caution people who get very adamant about one or the other that we're really not quite sure to what degree there is the development of the sagittal crest. And if it proves that she does, or you know, another picture of a female shows unmistakable that I mean, it's hard to tell. Even with an extant gorilla, the large males have a very pronounced fatty pad of fat and connective tissue that sits on top of that crest. So what you're seeing in the shape of their head with that, especially with that dome, isn't an ever rising sagittal crest, but that profile is augmented by the presence of that fatty tissue on top of the crest. So,
Yeah.
it's hard to know exactly what we're looking at.
Okay.
But the presence of a crest in a female ape is not contradictory to nature, to the possibilities.
Fair enough.
Okay.
All right.
Let me go to the other end of the body.
Yeah.
Practically speaking, if I see a line of footprints in the dirt at a campsite out in the woods somewhere, maybe out in the middle of nowhere,
Right.
what sort of characteristics would I want to look at to determine if it's more interesting than just another hiker?
Right. Well, obviously the first one is size. So if you're over 11 inches, you've narrowed it down to about 0.5% of the population. So size is the first thing. We seem to have a plethora recently of footprints that get reported to me that are between 8 and 11 inches in length. And so right off the bat, then you've got to be suspicious of, even if it's in a remote and out of the way place. But then there are other characteristics that are tells. The Sasquatch foot has a much greater breadth to length ratio in both the heel and the forefoot. So when you see these, if we're talking about hoaxes versus non-hoax, you see these swim fin shaped feet with a little narrow heel. They're usually artificial extensions of a human footprint that are just widened out to increase the length and breadth, but they, leave a narrow heel. But a nice broad rounded heel on the Sasquatch foot, a relatively flat foot. Now the Sasquatch, having a very flexible foot, is capable of twisting in a supination posture that raises the medial side of the foot. It doesn't look exactly like a longitudinal arch of a human, but it's similar enough to someone not experienced with that would say, well, look, it has an arch. But usually flat-footed, and also, since they don't have a permanent arch with weight particularly disposed over limited points of pressure, namely the heel and the ball, they don't have a well-differentiated, differentially thickened ball of their sole pad. It's more uniform thickness across the entire a foot, as evidenced from, for example, examples where they say have stepped on a stone. There's a couple of interesting articles. One was written by Susan Cashel, a paleontologist many years ago, evaluating a footprint from the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla that stepped on a stone, and she actually estimated the sole pad thickness of this creature based on that. I think she was a little bit excessive, but nevertheless, it was an interesting paper. So flat foot, lack of differentiation of a ball. The toes tend to be more subequal and, of course, spread out a bit more tendency for splaying than in a typical human. And humans, because of our habit of wearing shoes, at least most of the year, often have a little toe that's literally bent over on its side. And that's a dead giveaway. I mean, we had a case here in Idaho up near Grangeville where a newspaper delivery truck driver claimed he saw a Sasquatch and had this really sketchy photograph and a line of footprints across this kind of frosty soil. But, the prints were there in the soft fallow field. This guy had not only did he have a hyper arch, but he clearly wore cowboy boots. His toes were about as pinched as you could imagine. And the little toe was completely on its side. You could even see the imprint of the nail clear over on the far side. And there was just no question. The guy had a pretty big foot. This one was almost 12 inches long. So he's a tall guy. But so those are the tells. The length, the size, the breadth to length ratio, the flat, flexible foot sometimes will show a mid-tarsal pressure ridge because of the tendency to push off from the forefoot, the lack of a differentiated ball, the more equal-sized toes, so you don't get that huge jump from the big toe to this little grape-like second toe, third, fourth, fifth, down at an angle. The toes tend to be more evenly spread with a less, I mean, there is a differential. They do have a big toe, but it's not as big by comparison. And the ability to splay.
And even if even Shaquille O'Neal walking through there, it would be a completely different shaped foot. You know, at a 14-inch track, Shaquille O'Neal.
Oh yes,
yes. I mean,
yeah. I've always wanted to get a copy of the mold of his foot. I've had a couple of big basketball players come into my lab and let me take molds, but their feet were only about 13 inches long, but they look like bananas compared to the Patty's foot, which is rather gracile. Yeah. The female breadth to length ratio is a little bit less, noticeably less than the big males that are, you know, a good inch and a half broader for length than the females. Females almost look parallel sided. They don't have much flair. And I'm generalizing, and there's probably a lot of overlap, as you would expect in any population. But, you know, if you take Patty, and the other big male at that time in that region was the famous Jerry Crew, was the first publicized documentation of it, but it was cast by other people at other times over a number of years in that region. Man, it's you know, a full 17 inches and much broader at the forefoot. Has a more of a wedge shape compared to Patty's rather gracile, parallel-sided foot outline. I think it makes a good male-female contrast.
All right. What do you got to know?
Nope. Hey, it's good to be here and good to talk to you, Jeff. I had a quick question. What are your thoughts about the Olympic projects, the nests that they found, and if you think they are Bigfoot related?
Yeah, I do. I think very, very highly of them. I think it's a fascinating incident. I mean, from the very get-go, the timber cruiser who identified them has spent, you know, he's one of these guys that we'd add to that list that spend an inordinate amount of time in the woods, came upon them and immediately came to the conclusion that these were not just simply bear beds. This was something different and unusual. They were removed and remote, tough to get to from even the nearest road, and that road was behind a locked gate on private forest company land and lumberland. And
do you know about how old the surrounding forest was with the nest as far as the growth?
I don't. I mean, they hadn't. There were huge mature trees from my recollection of it, but I don't know how long that stand had gone without any harvesting. They held off. They agreed. The timber company agreed to hold off and forestalled cutting for 5 years. So they apparently weren't in a hurry to get in there. Although I understand that's expired now. But so when I finally was invited to come and examine the site, one of the things we did was we cut a pie-shaped wedge out of one of the nests. Just brought some pruning shears and literally cut down through the material, carefully pulled that wedge out, and we bagged that. And then you could see the stratigraphy, the layers, and pardon me, the internal structure. It wasn't just a hummock of detritus, you know, forest duck that you would expect with a bear that just scrapes things into a pile. I mean, all they're interested in is basically getting a layer between them and the ground for insulation. But there were sticks, half inch to an inch in diameter that had been pulled in there and kind of just not interwoven, in any intricate way at that point, but just laid on there, cross-hatched, and then debris on top of that. And then by debris, I mean just forest stuff and so forth. But then the location was really quite strategic. It was up on the crest of about a 300-foot drop, steep angle down to the brook down below, which was big enough that salmon could come up and spawn in it. And then across the backside of this location, there was like a big hedgerow of evergreen blueberries, and these in this forest grow to be about 8 feet tall. And something had, I mean, you could clearly see. But when I got there, they had been monitoring the area for probably about 3.5, 4 years, and so there was quite a bit of growth. But you could still see where they had originally been pinched off the green sprouts, and then of course you remove the apical meristem, then the side branches grow, and so you had these little crowns everywhere that the sprouts had been, the boughs had been pinched off, and those had been contributed to the added to the nest, not just heaped up, but they were literally woven in. They had stuck the stems in first, and then literally plated the boughs. So you had this nice gentle depression with a rounded rim that was big enough for somebody at least as big as me, if not bigger, to curl up kind of in a fetal position. You're not like a cot stretching out. The thing that really struck me was one of the nests was smaller. It was only about 1.5 feet, 2 feet across, and it was built in the crook of a shrub, about 2 feet off the ground. And you looked at that, and the first thing you thought it was a bassinet. And it's like the light kind of went off, because I was, even from the very get-go when they described these and any report of nests, I'm always wondering, yes, these animals are rare, but if they're making nightly nests like a gorilla, you would expect in a temperate forest to find evidence of that kind of more widespread than, in the Virunga Mountains or down in the Congo. Things grow so fast that any night nest on the ground is going to be just overgrown within a matter of weeks, and so, or if not days. But anyway, so the thought was rattling around, why this kind of anomalous discovery, and then that's when the penny seemed to drop that maybe this was a birthing event. Now, birthing events are rare, I suspect. If we can bracket on the basis of other grade 8 natural history parameters, they're long-lived and reproduce infrequently. Orangutans only give birth every 6 to 7 years, and so maybe that this was a rare birth event, and some of the clan kind of got together to support, the aunties to help the midwifery and the male to protect the group and so forth. There were a couple of interesting artifacts. By one nest, there were 2 rocks that had to have been brought up from the stream bed that clearly showed marks of percussion, as if they were used to clack together for signaling or whatever. Who knows what?
Do you recall the elevation of these nests?
Well, it wasn't very high. This was right back behind Derek Randall's residence, and it's out there on the far side of the sound. It's less than 1,000 feet probably in elevation. So it's not. There was well, not. Let me take that back. Maybe a couple thousand feet, because obviously there was a bit of topography. As I said, it was about a 300-foot drop down that one slope. Maybe that's an overestimate, 150 feet, but it was pretty steep. Pretty steep, pretty far down to the stream. But still, this whole area is pretty low. We're not way up into the Olympic peninsula in Olympic Forest. This wasn't their site up north where they have their, they're building their facility. It was much closer to Derek's home. We carefully went through and pulled out every fiber we could find at the time. And then we also picked through, part of the reason for bringing the pie section home is I let that air dry and had students go through it under the dissecting scope and collect every fiber they could find. They were thorough. There was a lot of lichen and mycelium and things like that, and also any whole leaves that we could identify various plants, and there were some hair that fit what we call the gold standard. That is, they have the characteristics that Henner Fehrenbach kind of delineated after looking at numerous previous reports and samples that came to his attention of what appeared to be primate hair of indeterminate origin. And some of these hairs matched up to that. We did take core samples. There were several nests that had been kind of sheltered, so no one could go near them or get in them. You'll see some photos of people demonstrating for scale and for utility lying in the nest. And in those that were untouched, I went in, gloved and masked and everything, and took core samples from the soil in the center of the nest. We sent that to Todd Dissetil at NYU. He ran a pretty cursory examination, and the only primate DNA was human in his estimation. And I pressed him on this. This kind of brought it to a head, because I pressed him on that, and he was looking at one part of one mitochondrial gene, which, if you look at Neanderthal and human sequence, has several substitutions that differentiate the two species. And I said, okay, well, that's good for Neanderthal. You've identified a marker or a stretch that differentiates Neanderthal and human, but there's no telling that Sasquatch has those same substitutions. And you could be looking at two identical stretches of DNA in comparisons between human and Sasquatch. He didn't think that was likely to be the case. So I've been asking this question, because this is what we keep running into. On those rare occasions when DNA is recovered, it almost invariably comes back as human, and it's assumed it's either because of contamination due to handling by the witness, or that it's simply a misidentified human hair. But the third possibility that no one has addressed, because it requires time and money and manpower, is, are we sequencing sufficient to differentiate a very closely related species? And I've started using a simple analogy that I think illustrates it quite well and people can grasp. We could be talking about a level of difference on the order of, say, 0.5% or 0.1%. If chimps are identical to us up to 98% by some estimates, some measures, then this creature, especially if it is a hominin on this side of the separation between chimp ancestors and human ancestors and relatives, it could be very close to us. So imagine you've got an Advent calendar, with the little doors to get your chocolate, 24 little windows to open up until you get to Christmas. But now let's imagine you've got 1,000 windows, okay? And if we say, for the sake of this argument, it's 0.1%, then that means only 10 windows. Yeah, 10 windows. Am I doing my math right? 10 windows will have some information behind them that differentiates us from them. But you have a study that only finances and allows enough time to open 10 of those 1,000 windows. So what are the odds that you open up a window that actually has a piece of chocolate in it that isn't empty? And if the 10 that you have come out as not one of those non-10, then the results are going to simply indicate that what you're looking at is human DNA.
Exactly.
And I think that's what we run into. So
yeah, it's a funding issue. It's a taboo issue.
well, that's exactly. See, I've reached out. I've reached out to many labs, and some of the best ones that are regularly doing DNA of grade A's for various studies, and invariably they not interested. Don't want to. Either they make a polite "I don't have the time," or they're quite frank and say, "Well, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole."
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, Doctor. Like from my point of view, that's kind of understandable.
Oh, it is.
In
this age of publish or perish, these labs are dependent on a steady source of funding, and if that were put at risk, or they can't justify having one of their postdocs who would otherwise be producing publications and writing grants work on a high risk subject that might not turn up a result in the allotted time, it's water under the bridge. It's wasted time.
Meanwhile, they've got paid projects that are footing their bills.
Well, right, exactly. Yeah,
right, and I would say, and this has become a new thing in the Bigfoot world that is not understood correctly, is that it would be the same with environmental DNA, which is cutting edge technology. It would be the same.
Oh yeah. I've been in conversations with a molecular biologist who's eager to undertake this, but he says, I'll need a postdoc and support for the postdoc and a graduate student or two, because it's not just a couple of weeks. We're talking about a multi-year project. This was the researcher who led the international team to look at Loch Ness.
Yeah.
And they spent 3 years before they had results to publish, conclusions drawn. And so, when once we get past COVID, this put a kink in our plans with restrictions on international travel and recruiting of international students and so forth. New Zealand's pretty tight borders at the moment. So when we get past this is what we hope to do, but it's going to cost several $100,000 to finance this project. And I'm crossing my fingers. I've got a few people in mind and a few organizations in mind. I think we can cobble that together, plus his resources. But yeah, it has to be a major commitment, major undertaking to do it.
And I think it's important to point out in everything that was just discussed, especially with DNA, because there's a misconception, I'll say, in the Bigfoot world that, hey, if you find something out there in the woods, say, albeit hair or dung or blood, even whatever it is, hey, you can go down to your local Main Street on the corner DNA shop and hand it over to them and say, you should look at this. And oh, by the way, look for undiscovered primate.
Yeah.
There's a and even with eDNA, with environmental DNA, that Bigfooters can just go collect it from an environment that maybe they found a trackway. Let's say, Dr. Meldrum, let's say they found a legitimate trackway, and they could just collect it in their little thing, wearing gloves or whatever, and send it off to who? I know. What price?
I get inquiries about that all the time, and I have to say, well, whether it's hair or whatever, too, I'm happy to stick a hair under a microscope and take a close look at the morphology, but I'm personally not set up, and I just don't have any other contacts. The only person who's really stepped up to the base, to the plate consistently has been Dr. Dissatel at NYU. And but again,
if I may, could I go back to the hair? I realize I've been aware of the Dr. Henner Fehrenbach's cataloging of these various samples, and of course what what information had been available that I could find over, just years of delving into studying and reading anything I could. That, I understand that typically, the hairs are lacking the central medulla.
Right.
They're naturally tapered on the ends. They're wild. They've never been cut. And while they may resemble human, and they're certainly considered to be primate by their morphology, but if they all are so, I'm just always so stunned that if we actually have physical evidence, actual hair of unknown primate, that doesn't just flip the table for so many people. I can't believe that Bigfooters themselves don't point to it more often. And I'm curious to know, is Dr. Fahrenbach's collection is it still curated somewhere? Is it ongoing? Can you comment on that?
I can, yes. He is spending his time now looking through a telescope instead of a microscope down in the Southwest. That's his passion now, and he has kind of washed his hands of it. And what he saved, what materials he did save, as far as photomicrographs and so forth, he has passed on to me. And I have, like I said, I welcomed people sending their samples to me to look at, and unfortunately, because as been mentioned earlier, hair persists in the environment and is easily misassociated with a particular event, and so literally, 8 or 9 times out of 10, a sample that's sent to me turns out to be something other. Easily attributable to deer or a coyote or something like that. So we're kind of carrying on like that. And I really pressed Henner. At one point he was hooking up with some folks at Ohio State University, and they had done some DNA analysis on some samples, including some samples from China. And they let slip a little bit of preliminary result, and it created such a furor in the press that they kind of backed off. I don't know if there was pressure from the university or from colleagues, but
Really?
Henner was he was dependent, I think, a little bit on hitching the morphology to a definitive DNA analysis. And he saw those as interlinked. And when the DNA disappeared, he was uncomfortable, was not secure in his convictions about what the take-home message from the hair really was. The problem is that the morphology, unless you really got down into cuticle structure, and we still could do this. I hope to do this eventually at some point. But the cuticle structure, the follicle structure, and so forth, there are some humans that have hair that is comparable to our samples. Sasquatch hair is not much different in coarseness, in texture of the average, and there's a range of variation, human hair. Some human hairs, particularly light blonde hair, towheads, lack a cellular medulla. That cellular medulla tends to add some structural stiffness to the shaft of the hair. And so some people could look at this alleged Sasquatch and say, oh, well, that's just a human. Well, how would you arbitrate that contention with DNA? Unfortunately, the lack of the cellular medulla means there's very little nuclear or mitochondrial structure that would contain DNA. It's just a keratin shaft, extracellular protein in the cortex, and it's very difficult. See, this was the hope. See, when Brian Sykes came on the scene, he claimed that he had this technique to clean the hair shaft of any contaminants and then digest it and free up any trace DNA from more efficiently from the shaft of the hair. So I was thinking, crossing my fingers, this is it then. This is the breakthrough, because that's been our challenge. Well, unfortunately, his design, and I hate to speak ill, and he's not here to rebut, but his paper was more of a distraction than it was an assist. I offered to screen the samples morphologically so that he could focus his tests on samples that fit the gold standard. And he said, oh, no, we can't impose a presupposition about what Sasquatch hair looks like. And I said, well, if you open the barn doors, everything in the barnyard is going to come in. You're going to be testing everything under the sun. And sure enough, if you look at his paper, the laundry list is long. I mean, even down to porcupine guard hairs. Yeah. I can hold a porcupine up to the light here in the office without even a microscope and tell you what it was, probably with a little familiarity. I mean, the coarseness. And anyway, and so, but the important thing was that there were samples, some of my own included, that weren't acknowledged in his study as having been received and incorporated. And I had some that were gold standard. I mean, I had some, because despite his demurring at that offer, to taking my offer up, I invited people to transit their samples through me, and then I selected those that were the best, that were the most likely, that fit the gold standard, and screened. I mean, it's really easy to pick out, for example, the deer hair. They have a medulla that looks like frothy bubbles. It's almost the width of the shaft of the hair. Again, it's very simple to differentiate things like that. Anyway, my point is this: a study which concludes that all of the samples received and tested turn out to be attributable to other forms of common wildlife, that's a very different conclusion than if he had demonstrated that 90% of the samples he received were readily attributable to other wildlife, but here were 10% that we just couldn't get DNA from for some reason. And interestingly, they all have the same morphology. That would have been a totally different conclusion. But I fear, and I say this tentatively because I cannot prove it, other than by inference, by the fact that there were samples, not only mine, but other people who claimed to have sent samples in that were never acknowledged in his list of contributors and sample numbers and so forth. If he threw out of the study samples that didn't yield DNA, then I think he threw the baby out with the bathwater and did a real disservice. Very, honestly and bluntly, a real disservice to us by, because this is the problem. Every time, it's just like when the FBI story broke, that Peter Byrne had submitted a sample to the FBI for analysis. He doesn't remember ever having received a reply, but they had it on file. Someone got it through Freedom of Information request, and it turned out to be deer. Well, I was quite impressed that the FBI actually took the time to test his sample, to examine it under the microscope. I can just imagine whoever opened that envelope from Peter. But the sad thing is, Peter should have known better. He should have done his work before he submitted the sample, because it added one more bit of grist to the mill every time, because it adds to the narrative that every time somebody takes an official authoritative examination and takes a look at one of these samples, it turns out to be something common and misidentified. And so that's the impression that everyone goes away with. They don't know. They never hear about the samples that didn't yield DNA. They don't realize that there's this whole collection of hairs that defy attribution to anything other than possibly a human. Oh, and I meant to say, when I said there are some humans, especially towheads, that's really the distinction, is we've got the full range of color phase for Sasquatch what we think is Sasquatch hair, that are all lack a cellular medulla. So it's not just the blonde ones; it's the dark black ones have no cellular medulla as well, which is not usual for human hair. But there's all these hairs out there now, or samples that have been examined that have this consistent morphology. Where are they coming from?
Patrick, you want to add something to that?
I have a question about hair.
Okay.
All right. If you shine a spotlight on a Sasquatch at 6 feet, and its hair does not reflect light for your eyes to see, it's almost like the light wraps around him. Is there a physical attribute that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of anything that would cause something like that. So there was no. I mean, was it illuminated? It just wasn't reflective. It was. I mean, obviously, for you to see something, light has to bounce back to your eye.
Exactly. That's what I was getting at. When you shine a being like that at 6 feet with a large spotlight, and all you see is his eyes.
Oh.
The trees are lit up around it, but it's not lit up. And when you get closer, you step forward and you put the brightest, whitest spot of that spotlight on their back, and all you see is just the glistening of hair, and you can move that spotlight around, and you can find different patches, of the hair. It's just glistening, but it's not actually showing any color or anything.
I don't know. That would baffle me. I don't know of any mechanism that's understood. Sure, there'd be people who'd be very interested in that kind of quality to a material.
Yeah.
Would bend light.
Yeah, or possibly bend light. I mean, gravity bends light.
Well, sure. Well, yeah.
But not down here on the surface.
Right. Yeah. That's.
Yeah.
Well,
it takes big objects like the sun to bend light.
Well, I was just curious if there was a physical something to a hair.
Well, some hairs do have some, iridescence, or, I don't know if they have the ability to refract light and disperse it, scatter light. So if in hitting it, the light is somehow scattered instead of reflected, that would give you your kind of, a ghostly kind of ephemeral appearance. But I don't know what quality. I mean, nothing that I've examined, and I haven't tested things for that, but nothing that I've examined when I open up an envelope would suggest. I mean, it should work for low intensity light as well as high intensity light, you would think. I haven't noticed any effect like that with any samples I've handled, but who knows? Stranger things.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a strange aspect to the phenomena. I mean, I don't mean outrageously strange, again, back to any kind of fill the void with your own worldview thing. But some people report, like Patrick just said, I can't wrap my head around why the light isn't, shining on this thing like it does normal animals, let's just say.
Yeah. Well, and I want to let me just emphasize too, to your viewers who do lean to more paranormal explanations or rationalizations. It's not that I'm. I have a certain degree of skepticism, obviously, but
so do we.
Yeah, but it's not that I'm saying those things are just impossible. But I'm approaching the topic as a scientist, and one of the mechanisms by which I've been trained to do that. This is the one place where Occam's razor is appropriately applied. Occam's razor, I usually get on my soapbox because it's such a abused notion that has been misconstrued. If you ask people what does Occam's razor or parsimony mean, they'll say they'll pipe back, and you hear it in movies and things, and TV documentaries. The simplest explanation is, more likely to be true, most likely to be true. That's not what Occam said. Occam was a philosopher of science, and strict philosophy of science suggests that science, we're incapable of testing all possible scenarios, all possible cases. So we can't prove by exhaustive demonstration that something is true. Instead, what we try to do is look for that one exception that will knock the legs out from under your hypothesis and cause you to rethink it and modify it accordingly. Well, in order to approach science in a systematic fashion, then, Occam said we should not multiply factors unnecessarily, meaning you start with the simplest explanation and you try to falsify it. You try to knock the legs out from under that before you're justified in moving on to a more elaborate explanation. Mm-hmm. So as a scientist, based on my evaluation of the evidence that's been presented to me, that I've uncovered myself, my own personal experiences in the field, I haven't been able to knock the legs out from under the hypothesis that this is a flesh and blood creature. It's a bipedal primate, but I could be proven wrong. I mean, I could experience those things, but every time I've gone out with someone who claims repeated experiences like this, like orbs of light, for example. This one gentleman was insistent. And so I said, well, do you have any photographic evidence? Oh, yes, of course I do, he said. So I said, well, will you send me your best picture illustrating an orb? And he said, oh, sure. So he emailed me a picture. It was a flash picture at night in the forest, and the pine trees were pollinating, and every piece of pollen was illuminating, and those were his orbs. He was adamant that those were the orbs. So that's the kind of experiences that I've had.
Yeah.
Well, I systematically went through trying to debunk. I spent 8 years trying to debunk this phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And what I did is I took the knock, because everybody says, oh, they knock.
Sure, yeah.
So I took the knock out away from Sasquatch and took the knock out and used it until I had a 30 counter. So I could not debunk Sasquatch any further. My hypothesis of it's a known animal doing an unknown action after the sun goes down went out the window.
Yeah.
And I'm not. And as far as the hair and the reflection goes, I'm not. I've heard some people call it woo, that they cloak.
Yeah.
But to debunk that, I step forward. I can still see it in the light. It didn't disappear. It was physically there.
Right.
It's just there's something about the hair didn't work out.
Right.
So
hominid with octopus capabilities, if you would, Dr. Meldrum. There's a couple of things I want to touch on here real quick, and this is important to me. This is something you'll never hear in the Bigfoot world, but I'm going to say it, and we're going to talk about it, Dr. Meldrum, because I've always wanted to pick your brain about this. Square cube law.
Where
do you think there's a limit to their size?
Oh, yeah, I do. I mean, I think there certainly there are limits, mechanical constraints, physical constraints to how big a creature can be without drastically modifying their morphology. I mean,
and gravity for a biped.
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can't take a mouse and make it the size of an elephant without turning it into an elephant. I mean, the robusticity of the skeleton, the alignment of the limb segments and the joints involved, and so forth. And other aspects, obviously, of the physiology and so on.
But even better. I mean, we have an example of a 15-foot tall biped it's called a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It
Right.
looks nothing like a primate.
Exactly. That's the point.
Yeah.
It has a different morphology and a different biomechanics. I mean, and also Tyrannosaurus Rex can only get so big before it has to start looking like a Brontosaurus or a Patasaurus.
Mm.
So the biggest footprint cast that's credible that I have in my lab is 19 inches. Anything over 20 inches, I'm extremely skeptical of, and either its credibility or the ability of the witness to accurately measure an object. You don't know how many times I get these inflated length estimates, and when they send the photo, they've got the tape measure extended 2 inches in front of the toes, and the 15-inch mark is actually an inch and a half past the heel. And they say, oh, yeah, they're 15-inch footprints. And I go, well, how are you measuring that? And anyway, or a scale. The other day I got a picture, and someone had laid down their knife, and they said it was a 16-inch knife. Well, I don't have a lot to go on, but most knives, the handle is a pretty standard dimension, to accommodate. Yeah, exactly, to hold it. And this knife wasn't even 14 inches in length. It was closer to 12 inches in length. So you get exaggeration. Anyway, the point being is I don't have anything over 19 inches, which would translate to probably something that was less than 10 feet tall.
And let's say this, to be fair, to the tracks, is it possible there could be a 22-inch track, that matched up to a 10-foot tall individual, maybe because they had, extra big feet,
Right. Oh, sure. Yeah. Any formula that you come across that say represents a foot length to stature relationship is based on a regression line that has variation bounding it. Yeah. So yes, you're absolutely right. Who was it? John Napier? No. Ivan Sanderson, in one of his books, showed a picture of two men who were the same height, and he showed their hands and their feet. And even though they were the same height, they had slightly different body builds. The one guy had a foot that was a full inch and a half longer than the other guys, and had a hand span that was a good inch broader than the other guy. But they were the exact same height, close to the same weight. So yes, there's that kind of variation. You need to take that into account. But when you have people who are asserting that there are true giants that are 15 feet tall, I mean that just doesn't jive anymore with the landscape, with the texture of the landscape. They'd be towering above the trees and so forth.
Or gravity.
Right, well, exactly. And the physical.
Yeah, I mean, again, Tyrannosaurus Rex, 15 feet tall, a complete different design. If you take a primate form, right, bipedal primate form, you put it into a 15-foot scale with gravity, I'm sorry, the thing wouldn't be able to stand up.
There are problems, and if you do any research into the the lives, the biographies of human giants, human of exceptional height, they are typically riddled with especially those that are pituitary giants that have hormonal imbalances. They're riddled with all kinds of other ailments, and oftentimes you see that they walk with canes because their joints and their bones just don't tolerate that stress.
Yeah, I mean, who? Robert Wadlow?
That rings familiar. I think I know.
Well, the tallest man alive.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Robert Wadlow.
With 2 canes,
And, and he died at the ripe age of 21.
Right.
And could barely stand up. Yeah.
Andre the Giant died at a relatively young age. Not a ripe old age, but it was from complications.
Well, he drank
gigantic
10 million beers too, but
that helped, I'm sure.
But he was truly giant. I'm sure you've seen pictures of his hand in scale. I mean, he was about as big as Patty. like roughly.
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah, some of the proportions. Well, and some of the, there's sometimes are disproportionate enlargement of the hands and facial features and so forth. But yeah, since you mentioned Patty, that was an interesting investigation where Dr. David Daglin kind of took Grover Krantz to task, saying that Grover exaggerated his claim that there was no human alive that fit Patty's dimensions. And he claimed or contradicted that. He seemed to. But when I dug into his source, this anthropometric data volume that he referred to, he'd chosen the wrong metric. Instead of he was equating chest breadth to a chest tape measure, which goes from middle of armpit around the front of the chest to the other armpit. Well, a curved line is much longer than a straight projected line.
Right.
But he wouldn't admit the difference. I pointed it out to him after one of his presentations, and then it appeared in his book. So I took him to task in my book review.
Well, there is no known.
Nobody.
There is no known human alive in 1967 that matches what we pretty much have dialed in, for Patty's proportions. I think, 7'2", the width and volume, the volume of Patty, which you and I would agree on, Dr. Meldrum. There was no known.
Even if you assume she was only 6 feet tall.
Right, correct.
And you had other humans that were 6 feet tall, her proportions outstripped them by, several inches in every direction.
Yeah, and we have a living witness who was on a horse who said she was about as tall as me on the horse. So so that matches more the 7'2".
Oh, exactly, yeah.
Which makes that volume even bigger. Yeah. And Andre the Giant is close to those proportions, but not in 67. Because number one, he was 21 years old and much leaner. Yeah. And number two, he was verified living in France. So he couldn't, not even Andre the Giant could have filled out that volume.
Right. Been there.
I mean, we're talking 1980s Andre the Giant.
Yeah.
You know, so he couldn't have been there to do that and that volume, and so there was really nobody who could fit that bill.
Right. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah.
Steve?
Pretty singular.
I'd like to step back to DNA for just a couple seconds. Most of the time, species identification is done with mitochondrial DNA by sequencing just 2 genes. And after talking to Dr. Hart and also to Dr. Ketchum, I think the better study in the future would look at doing the whole mitochondrial DNA sequencing, which is easier to do with today's technology than it was 5 or 6 years ago. And that gives you the whole picture of what's there. So you've got all 1,000 windows, and then you can look at all of the windows.
Right. That's exactly right. In fact, that as I queried at every opportunity geneticists, molecular biologists, and posed this conundrum to them, that was their response. They said more than once, if I were doing it, I would do the entire mitochondrial genome and at least a dozen nuclear genes as well, which can be even more discriminating in some instances. And so that's what we're up against. That's what we need to do. If we just keep doing the thing where, it gets sent to Dr. Distel, I mean, unless he's, in the sense of doing a quick and dirty study for a documentary, say, versus a full-blown analysis, or if you ship it off to a commercial lab, that has no vested interest, they're just going to do whatever the work order says. You're just going to get a very cursory kind of treatment. and end up back at square one,
Yeah.
in my estimation. So
Yeah, the
Okay,
whole
so
DNA
regarding-
thing is much more complicated than the Bigfoot world understands. So.
well, yeah, they're steeped in CSI, where you can just to get results
Right.
and test everything. Every cigarette butt has the final arbitration.
So we need the right script.
Yeah.
Need a good reason. We have to listen. We have to give them a good reason to want to look further into it. To me,
Right.
it's actually that logically simple.
Yeah.
And there's a way to do that. So,
We'll get there.
yeah, Brent, I'll give you another opportunity here to say what you think.
About I was following the comments.
Okay. All right. Okay. Cool. Never mind. We're moving on. Just kidding. No. Yeah. Like pick Dr. Meldrum's brain.
Oh, okay. So back in the mid '90s, you did a surprise visit to Paul Freeman, and he took you out to some trackway. And I was just kind of curious if you wanted to maybe talk about that, and maybe some thoughts that you just wanted to kind of share with us from your visit and impressions of Paul Freeman.
Right. Well, yeah. I'd gotten an earful about Paul from other sources. My interaction with him that didn't just fall out of the sky, but I was first introduced to that what was transpiring in that region by way of Richard Greenwell. I was actually on a plane flying back from the Redwoods, where we had done a documentary shoot on the Redwoods video, the Playmate video. And he reaches in his briefcase and he hands me a copy of that little paperback Bigfoot of the Blues that it's been reprinted as the Walla Walla Bigfoot, because apparently he said there was a lot of confusion about what the blues meant. They thought it was Bigfoot in Louisiana or something, Bayou country. But the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington and eastern Oregon. And he asked me to write a book review. So that was my first introduction to what was going on with the author, Vance Orchard, a columnist in, I think he was based at the Waitsburg Times, but his little column was carried in several of the little local newspapers. Ramblin' Times, I think is what he called it. But it was a kind of an outdoorsy column, and he was fascinated with Bigfoot. So anything that Paul Freeman discovered or talked about, and the book was essentially a compendium of his columns, sort of strung together and with bridging narratives that gave a snapshot of the past 10 years of Bigfoot activity in the Blue Mountains there of southeastern Washington, northeastern Oregon. And so as I read it, Vance is a very, very entertaining, engaging author. There was no criticism there, but you're left with, as you are with all journalism, how accurate was he conveying the facts? And so I wanted to do some follow-up with some of the personalities that were listed, mentioned in the book. And so I made myself a laundry list of people, and I contacted Vance and asked him, got acquainted with him over the phone, and he was delighted about my undertaking a review and was more than happy to provide me with a list of contact information. So, of course, at the top of that list was Paul Freeman and Wes Summerlin, that were some of the central figures, Bill Lowry as well, and Vance himself. And so I did. I followed up and talked to a lot of these people. Some were scattered to the four winds, some were up in Montana, and some down in Nevada. But they were all very forthcoming with information about their experiences, verifying what Vance had said or hadn't said, and then it was a series of events, kind of, again, talk about serendipity. It just happened that as a result of this involvement, I was in Boise with my family, extended family, and sitting there on the couch chatting with my brother and talking about this documentary. This was one of the first documentaries that I had been involved with down in the Redwoods. And I turned to him, and from Boise, it's only about it's 3.5, 4 hour drive, I guess, maybe a little longer than that, up to Pullman, Washington. And I said, let's give Grover Krantz a call and see if he would allow us to come pay him a visit this weekend. And so he invited us up, and so we jumped in the truck and headed north, and went up and visited him. Had a great time as he pulled out his cast collection. He really showed us the whole works, and I was obviously full of questions. This was the Redwoods video. I had thought would be a simple exercise in pointing out the zipper in this video segment, and I couldn't find a zipper. And instead, I kept finding more and more subtle details of anatomy that were really quite intriguing. And so this got the wheels, the cobwebs dusted off, and the cogs turning again, thinking about this issue, because I had kind of put it to bed long before. It was just a fluke, basically, that brought me into contact with Richard Greenwell. And then a couple months later, he calls me up and says, "We've got this piece of video evidence. Would you be interested, as a primatologist, as a functional morphologist, to aid in the evaluation?" And so it got me thinking about things again. And we went up to Grover's lab and saw these things, and he was very gracious. And when we left, rather than come straight down through Idaho, through McCall, I said, let's make a little diversion, stay on the freeway, at which you have to go over then to down through Walla Walla. And we just dropped in on West Summerlin first, and a very interesting conversation with him. He had some examples of footprints and so on. And of course, I'd seen copies of some of this original material in Grover's lab, but to see the originals. Now, Wes had this unfortunate habit of whitewashing his original casts to make them nice and clean so he could hang them up in the house. He had a plywood cutout of Patty, and he'd drive these little finish nails and then drill a hole in his cast and hang it up there. But not realizing that this slurry of plaster he was broad brushing with his coarse paintbrush was obscuring all of the contact surface details on these casts, many of which had dermatoglyphics. Because if you look up loess, glacial loess distribution across North America, there's a big patch in southeastern Washington and down into Oregon a little bit, and then a big swath across southern Idaho, and then you have to go over to the Midwest for the next big collections of this very fine powdery soil. So this is why the conditions in the Blue Mountains were very conducive to preserving skin ridge detail. And I have one of Wes's original casts that he let me take because he hadn't whitewashed it yet. It's a beautiful cast. The detail's amazing. You can see skin ridge detail quite evident on it, but it's a distinctive individual with long toes, very, very little webbing between the toes, so it makes the toes look longer than in many, where they're webbed right on up to that almost to the second interphalangeal joint, like Patty. Patty has a very extensive sole pad, and so from below her toes look like peas in a pod. But if you watch the film, there's one scene when the foot swings and the toes dorsiflex, and you can see how long they are. I had already done a reconstruction of what I thought the skeleton was like, and based on the anatomy of the sole and the flexion creases that were evident that indicated where those joints should be. And then it was only later that I noticed that particular little segment where you can see the toes, and it was spot on. They agree with what I had reconstructed. Anyway, so we visited with Wes, we saw these things, and then we zipped over to Paul. As we pulled up in front of Paul's house, he was just pulling into the driveway. And we got out, introduced ourselves. I had spoken with him. It wasn't completely a cold call because I had spoken with him a couple of times during my reading of the book and had given him a heads up that we hoped to come out, but we weren't going to. I was talking about coming out during spring break, which was about a month away. So he wasn't expecting us to pop in. There was no, I mean, even if Wes had called him after we had left his house, it still wouldn't have, because he wasn't home. And anyway, to make a long story short, what he would do is as soon as the snowpack began to melt back, exposing these low foothill roads, which were tertiary roads that were largely, I mean, basically they would gravel some of the real steep inclines, and there were some steep grades on some of those. But a lot of the roads were just graded dirt roads. And because of this fine soil texture in the spring and even the summer, when it was absolutely dry, when it was wet, it was very clayey, very slippery. When it was dry, it was like flour. And so you step and you'd also leave remarkably clear footprints, even in shallow dust. It would transfer remarkable detail. And they made great tracking beds. Any animal. I mean, one time I took someone up and there's a little stretch of this was it Skyline Road? Is that what it's called? It sits between the infamous Mill Creek watershed, where everyone thinks that everything's going on, but dropping off the other side of the saddle is the Wenatah-Tucson Wilderness, and it's a great spot there. The animals, kind of move back and forth. They're both roadless areas. The wilderness isn't restricted. The watershed is. But I took a camera crew and on one jaunt, we walked maybe 50 yards, and on that stretch, I could show them deer and elk and coyote and cougar and raccoon tracks crossing that road. I mean, it's just, unfortunately, no Sasquatch track on that occasion. But that's what Paul would do, is he would drive his pickup truck, with his window down, looking at the shoulder of the road, and he'd find tracks that way. If other people weren't bringing them to his attention, because once he made a couple of TV appearances, I mean, he became a lightning rod in that region. And he and Wes and Bill and some of those people would kind of get together at the eatery at the mall every Tuesday morning, was it? And have coffee and donuts or whatever, muffins, and people would come and share their experiences, or just sit to listen in to others telling their stories. It kind of became a little gathering point. And so he, heard a lot of reports of footprints from other people. But in any case, so it wasn't that he had the Midas touch, but he became the lightning rod in that area. And anyway, how much time do I get? But it was amazing. We pull up there and there's this. We're right up, just less than a quarter mile maybe from the national forest boundary. They cultivate right up some of those real steep grades. I mean, they use these, I'm not a farmer, but D9 tractors, I think is what they were calling about, to pull their equipment, and they'll go up these pretty steep grades and cultivate these slopes. And this was a little farm access road, and there was an irrigation ditch that came around that was brush lined and fallow fields, and the trees are just a few hundred yards off. Here were these tracks. He pulls in and stops. We get out and here this line of tracks, and there must have been 35, 45 tracks that we counted or looked at. I didn't think to actually count out. At one point we did, when we were trying to interpret what was going on, because Paul had read, he was a reasonable tracker. He certainly knew his way around the outdoors. When John Meinzinski, on one occasion, a good friend of mine, the wildlife consultant in Wyoming, he spent a couple days with Paul in the field and was quite impressed with Paul's natural history skills. He was very knowledgeable about the plants, edible medicinal plants, and so forth. So he wasn't a slouch. I mean, he knew his way. He didn't venture very far from his truck. His diabetes was really taking its toll. He ultimately lost his leg from the knee down on one side due to that diabetes. But leading up to that point, he wasn't as mobile, and he was pretty overweight as well, which just exacerbated it. But so that's why he would spend his time driving the roads, and there were lots of roads to explore as the spring melted things off. But he had read it absolutely wrong. Because it was kind of suspicious. It seemed that where we parked the truck, the track started, made a hairpin loop out into the field, and came back and stopped where the truck was parked. And I'm thinking, that seems, you get in the bed of your truck, you pull on your stoppers, you jump into the mud, or trot out a little hairpin loop, and you dive in the back of the truck, kick off your muddy stompers, pull your shoes back on, and climb into cab, and off you go. So I thought, if this is real, there's got to be more tracks. There's got to be more tracks down this way. Well, we looked and searched, and there, if they were there, we should have found them. We didn't. And I'm going, Well, the only other possibility is he's reading this wrong. First of all, let's pin out all the tracks and see what we've got. Well, it turns out that the inflection point, the hairpin turn, was not out in the field. It was right under where the truck had been parked. We took him home, by the way. We took him home, dropped him off, and we came back. And we parked up the road a little further so we wouldn't drive over anything. The hairpin turn, where it literally turned on its heel and started walking back the other way very briskly, looking over its shoulder with its every second step, it was looking back with its right foot angled out 45 degrees. And then it took off running. Well, we explored further down towards this irrigation ditch, and sure enough, we found tracks with no sign of Paul. His footprints were, to be seen just as we got there. And then, of course, we walked around. We were careful not to step on anything, but we found more tracks further down. And so the scenario seemed to be just the opposite. It had come around the hill up from the Mill Creek, following this irrigation ditch undercover, and then it had struck out across this access road, down the road, angling towards the grade that went up this particular ridge that dropped over into the watershed. And from there, it had a straight line. He could either, hang out in the watershed or go up over and into the wilderness area and be, long gone from any human interaction. But I think this was the first weekend that the snows had melted back enough that you could actually get up onto that ridge road. And so my suspicion is, the tracks were so fresh. When I knelt down, and given the rainy conditions, some of them were inundated with water and all, but when I knelt down, you could actually see skin ridge detail in some of these tracks. So they had to be less than 8 hours old. And so it was probably, we were there in the mid to late afternoon. It was in the wee hours of that early morning, I think, or late that night, previous night. And I suspect, as it headed for that grade that went up onto the ridge road, this was probably the first weekend that you could get up there in a four-wheeler. And there's probably somebody up there doing a bonfire or whatever, imbibing. And they were on their way back in the dark, and something spooked this thing, and it turned and started back, looking over its shoulder to assess the progress of the headlights, bouncing down. And I'm envisioning. And at one point, you could see it decided it needed to get into cover, and it took off running. And on that particular track that was angled out, the weight pivoted on the distal end, and the toes slid back across the instep as the stride doubled in length. And then we had a series of half tracks just up on the front half of the foot where it was running. And one of those where it was on a slight incline in the slippery mud, it slid and the toes dug in and gained purchase, but it was only the front half of the foot. Really remarkable. I mean, you could see the profile. The toes actually kind of expanded, and the profile of the outer edge of the first and fifth pressed into this deep sidewall of the imprint. And really amazing. So anyway,
Yeah.
This was my third encounter experience where the hair, I mean, even telling the story again, the hair on my arm stands up because that realization set in at that instant. At one point, it just suddenly you go,
Yeah.
they do exist. You know, a Sasquatch really walked by here last night. And
wow.
It was, that was awesome. The turning point. That, the hook was set deep and secure, and driving home that. And I mean, there still was that. I mean, it was an experience, but there still was that give and take. And so, we had to be back. My brother definitely had to be back. In hindsight, I should have had him drop me off at the car rental place and got in the car and stayed on for a couple more days and just called my class and canceled it on Monday, because I mean, gee whiz, the thing had to be somewhere close by. I mean, I'm sure they could cover a lot of ground in 8 hours, but there had to be more sign. Could have established that a lot more securely, solidly. But wow, it was pretty amazing.
That's interesting. I mean, you it sounds like you vetted that whole experience, that whole thing that happened. Like, it sounds like you vetted it quite well, actually.
Well, sure.
Which I would expect from you.
Well, I have to admit, it was one, and I can empathize with people who find themselves in a situation and may not think of everything they should have done. They forget to put a scale down next to them, because, to be quite honest, I was sitting there snapping pictures, and I did put scale down, and I was, had that much presence of mind. But I had a video camera in a case behind the bench seat of my brother's pickup truck that I totally forgot about. I could have videotaped.
Convenient. Convenient, Dr. Meldrum, that you forgot about your video camera.
I know. I mean, I probably took 50 pictures. This was before digital cameras even, but 50 slides. But and we made casts. We went after we dropped Paul off. We found on a Sunday afternoon, we found a hardware store that was still open, and got some paint buckets, and some plaster and stirring sticks and all that, and went back. And I said to my brother, even if this is a hoax, I mean, how often do you get to look at a line of tracks like this? I said, this is a great case study in the anatomy of a trackway, and I think we can do a lot with this. And but anyway, but then as it was, I didn't collect data as systematically as I should have. But I got 7 good casts and a lot of photographs, not a lot of measurements of stride, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So basically, answer me this, like, whatever was going on with Paul Freeman, like, would it be fair to say there was something legitimate going on there?
Yes, I think. I mean, I know. I'm quite confident there was some embellishment of some examples of footprints or handprints. Got a very good example of there was a handprint that I'm quite confident was legit, because the footprints associated with it that were cast at the same time are absolutely the real deal, because of the dynamics that are evident. And we have other examples of that same individual from that region that show even more variation in the foot position and everything. And Paul was a little disappointed in how this turned out, because the fingertips went straight down into the mud. It's like it kind of grabbed the soil. I think maybe it was pulling itself up. And when he poured the plaster, it was a bit thick. and didn't fill the fingers, these vertical fingers, so there were air bubbles caught down, or one of the tips, it looks like it broke off in the mud.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently, as it's told by some of the others involved, he shows up at the mall, at the eatery, with this new cast, and some people were kind of pointing at these broken fingertips that looked strange or not filled properly. So a couple of weeks later, he shows up with another handprint. It's obviously a knockoff of the first one, except he's completed the fingertips.
But better. Yeah.
But they look funny because they're these remarkably tapered. It's as if he used his own fingertips as models, right down to the nails. And now, it would be one thing if he had said, I wanted to see what it would look like if it was complete, if the fingertips were there. So here's my interpretation of what that would look like. But he didn't. He said that it was a new cast. So again, maybe that's holding someone to a standard that they've not that they're not familiar or even obliged to observe. They're not a professional scientist, and so why would they? I'm always reminded. John Bindernagel told a story where he was following up on a report on an Indian reservation up there, and he was out in the field, and he on the trail where the tracks had been observed, there were some kids coming back from fishing or swimming or something, some tribal teenagers, and he stopped them, and they were chatting, and he was talking about if they'd heard about the story, and they had heard of stories and so forth, and in fact they said, yeah, we've seen footprints on this trail before. And he goes, did you take any pictures? And the kids all kind of looked at each other and just laughed. Why would we do that? I mean, the mentality is completely different. Here's John. He's in science mode. You document. And these are just some tracks. It's like if you'd seen your dog run across the dirt road and left some footprints. Did you take photographs of it? Why would I do that? So I can appreciate when that there's different expectations and different standards. But Paul, he wasn't a Boy Scout. Let's put it that way. When it came to the occasional gilding of the lily, perhaps to make the story a little better, or to make it a little more convincing. I think some people, I think they're convinced, they've had the definitive experience in trying to convince other people that they're legit, that they're credible.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of blur the boundary between what's ethical and not so ethical by my standard.
I agree.
And, the end justifies the means, basically.
Yeah.
They make it more incredible to be credible.
Right.
That's a psychological phenomenon that it would require a different professional to analyze. But then again, they would have to kind of buy into the whole Bigfoot thing to begin with. Honestly.
Right. Well, the point is,
we have that guy. He's called Leon. Yeah.
Is that right?
Inside.
But the point is, I don't think it's justified to throw the baby out with the bathwater in this case. And there have been so many misstatements attributed to or associated with Paul. He acknowledged at one time that he had experimented with faking a footprint in his backyard. Right. Well, any researcher worth their salt has done that. I've done that.
But there was a book report, I don't recall the guy who wrote it, that was talking about how in the early days Paul was talking about how there were these prints, and I think you know which one I'm talking about, and he had to retract his statement because the local law enforcement for the watershed got involved.
I don't know about him ever retracting a statement. Joel Harden, are you talking about the board?
Yeah. I think it's the book, The Tracker.
Oh, yeah, he had to retract his statements in the...
Oh, no. I thought he retracted Paul retracted his... saying that the prints were not real, that he was doing it to to figure out prints and stuff. And
No, you or whoever you got the information from is conflating two different things. He acknowledged that he had experimented to see what it would take, if someone were to undertake to hoax a footprint. Just like, John Green and I took some fake feet that he had fabricated and went out to Harrison Lake and made fake tracks just to experiment. We did it in seclusion, away from the crowds and everything, and we obviously cleaned up after ourselves, so there wouldn't be any spurious reports.
What do you? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask a completely different thing on what were your thoughts about the London Trackway down in Oregon from a couple of years ago?
Let me just say one thing about
Yes.
Joel Harden, because his book is interesting to read, but you have to realize, and I'll just qualify what he says. He is a man tracker, and so if you read carefully, the criticisms he have of the Sasquatch tracks are all points upon which they differ from human footprints and human gait, and where they differ in exactly the way one would predict for a Sasquatch track. The lack of differential pressure under the heel and ball, the more even gait, because it's not walking with an extended limb, stiff-legged striding gait, which gives you a longer step on the flat, but it tends to shorten dramatically when you go up a slope. If you're always walking with a compliant gait, your step length is more consistent on the flat and up the slope, and on and on and on. You go through his report, every criticism, it either is a contradiction to human tracks or his inability to follow the trackway. I mean, how can a guy say that somebody wearing stompers was able to enter a location, stomp out footprints, take off the stompers, and then exit the location without leaving any sign of their own footprints before and after wearing the stompers? That's what he asserts must have happened. So he's saying, gee, I'm a Border Patrol man tracker, but I can't pick up a human sign from the known points of termination and beginning of their trackway.
Oh, wow.
So either he's reading it wrong to begin with, or he's admitting that he's not qualified to which I'm not saying he isn't, but I'm saying he's a man tracker. And anyway, as far as the London Trackway, the most telling thing about that was Cliff brought, when he was here at the lab on one of his visits, he brought a couple of DVDs where he had images of every single track that he had cast. So we sat here together at the computer, brought each of those images up, and we had a little measuring device, and we tried to find any demonstration of variation in toe position, and we couldn't. In all those examples, the toe tips were exactly equidistant. I mean, not between toes, but between images. There were positions relative to one another, never changed. And there were other features too. When you have a stiff foot and you try to toe off, it will create right there at the end, as it pushes in, there'll be a sharp angle down to the toes, which is a dead giveaway for a stiff foot. And there were multiple examples of that. So he's convinced that they're fake, and I'm convinced they're fake. There was a whole rash. I think there was some kind of a challenge, instead of pouring ice water over their heads, it was to see if you could fake footprints in drawn down reservoirs, because there were two. There was the Elby tracks, there was the London tracks, and then I had advertised that there was a case up here at the Palisades Reservoir that I investigated, and we were really hopeful. It was a marginally conceivable scenario, but looking at the tracks, the same kind of details, the tip toes, the sharp edges around some of the tracks where it was clearly a rigid, sharp-edged foot. They hadn't even rounded out the margins, and but they were all a string. They're within about a 6-month period, 6 months to a year.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I've actually been to both of those sites, the LB and the London Trackway, and it's a great spot for Bigfoot. But I was always curious about the London Trackway because I was getting kind of conflicting, and I didn't do a ton of research, but
Yeah.
I figured you're the guy to ask.
Yeah. I think Cliff had the most extensive collection of the prints, and Tom Powell had quite a number. And then with the LB Trackway, I mean, they've nailed it. If it wasn't Aaron Schwepson himself, it was some cohort, because they were able to track down his IP address, and he had talked about it online, and he's never completely fessed up to Cliff, but he's as close to acknowledging it and confessing as you can get. At least he had knowledge. He had firsthand knowledge of it. And see, there again, here's the interesting thing. See, whoever did it fabricated a pretty interesting foot, and but there were some of the same hallmarks of the toe imprints for one, but the dead giveaway, and we have to watch for this. I'm sure they'll eliminate it. There was a crease. If this were a foot, there was a crease right here, down around the big toe, the ball of the foot. Well, the only reason to have a crease right there is so the foot could fold like this. If the big toe could wrap around and oppose to the lateral digits like a thumb, which it can't, and no other footprint ever has shown that feature previously. So when we saw that, I mean, when I first encountered that in the photos and that was a big red flag. And then, of course, they dug into it and exposed it for what it was. But it was a good effort, but
no pun intended. If I may switch gears just a little bit, I want to talk about population. And so how I'm going to set this up, I'm going to go to Patrick Vaughn. And Patrick, give us kind of your boots on the ground idea of population. And I'm interested to see Meldrum's, thoughts about that.
Sure.
All right. I've been studying this phenomenon since 2003, and I can say that I've tracked 24 different individuals within 200 miles of me. So, you do the math on that and, get, individual per mile. And in my area, there's quite a few of them. Now, when I'm tracking, I'm finding more juvenile tracks than I am adults. In one area in southwest Mississippi, I found 8 tracks between 7 inches and 14 inches, and 14 inches isn't the cutoff for an adult. The average adult female track that I find is 15.5 to 16 inches, and a large male being 18 to, I have found them 22 inch, which was just the one oddball. That one, that was it. But normally, 18.5 to, 19 3/4 inch track.
Okay.
And so their numbers are increasing. And one place I tracked 12 miles from here on the river, just like you were talking about how the mindset of why would you pay attention to these tracks? Because my son and his friend were seeing barefoot tracks out here on the river in January, February while they're hunting barefoot. And these tracks are, 14 inch to 16 inch tracks.
Wow.
And then a smaller one that was about a 5 inch track that was toddling. The mom would pick it up and walk a little ways, put it back down. It'd take a few steps, pick it up.
Hmm.
And I said, who do you think would be out here in January, February on a riverbank barefooted? He said, we just thought it was people playing. You know, so I find there's a lot more of them than what people believe there are.
What are your ideas of population, Patrick? Like in your, I don't know, let's say 100 square mile area that you research.
Rudimentary math, and I had someone have a question on this. It's my rudimentary math is 1 per 7 square miles of national forest or WMA. Now that doesn't mean there's one every 7 square miles. What that means is there's a group of 4 of them in this radius that supports that math. So I have a group about 50 minutes from me, and then 40 miles north of that there's another group of 4, and then there's a group of 3 about an hour west from there, and then a group of 8 an hour and 15 minutes into Arkansas. So, if you start, doing the regional math on that, it boils down to, 7 square miles. But they're not scattered. They're all huddled here, and then 40 miles away, there's a huddle of them there.
What do you think about that, Dr. Meldrum?
Well, that's extraordinary. I'd really love to see how you have differentiated and I assume you're relying on footprint evidence to establish those individuals and numbers to discriminate them. I'd love to see your data sometime.
I've had 33 encounters with 8 face-to-faces. It's not all footprint, but footprint is most of what I catch. It's very hard to get next to them. It's not very hard to find where they are. And it's not that I'm anything special. It's just I think the areas down here are more conducive because I don't have thousands of square miles of forest to have to sift through and
right.
find in evidence. We'll have, a couple 100,000 acres of the forest, national forest, and it's broke down into 50,000 here and 30,000 there.
Right.
So it makes the hay pile much smaller.
Right. Well, my approach to population size numbers is an indirect one. I don't have the benefit of that kind of experience to draw upon, but based on the my starting point assumption is that they are largely solitary. So having consistent groups of 3 or 4, the vast majority of footprints that I'm aware of suggest solitary individuals, or as you described, females with offspring. And I suspect that males and females only get together as consort pairs on those rare occasions that the female is receptive. Like I was alluding to earlier, orangutans, their birth interval can be up to 7 years interspaced. So based on that model, the analog amongst the living great apes is the orangutan as far as a social structure where they are relatively solitary. A male, instead of controlling a harem of females, he defends or advertises his presence as the dominant male in a territory. It's real estate versus a harem, and the territory overlaps that of several females with offspring, and the offspring stay with the females for up till 10 or 12 years of age before even after a new baby comes along, in the case of the orangutans. Anyway, we have some indirect evidence based on a couple of different lines of data that suggest, one being repeat appearances of recognizable individuals in the track record, but also some a gentleman who did some work on sort of pattern analysis of databases of encounters reports and footprint reports, who which both point to a home range more on the order of about 1,000 square miles for that male, and so we know there's a good correlation between precipitation. John Green very early on drew attention to that correlation. And it makes sense. If you've got a large omnivore, you have to have about 18 inches of annual precipitation or more in order to sustain a large omnivore. There was a paper, interestingly, and from another angle, a paper recently published by an acquaintance of mine, Peter Anello, who's in a GIS technician. He and his colleagues were actually evaluating ecological modeling software packages. This was an editorial that was published in the Journal of Biogeography, and their concern, the motivation for the editorial, was that people were using these models, these prepackaged modeling software, indiscriminately, and they didn't really understand what was happening to their data. And so, to demonstrate the potential pitfalls, they decided to illustrate this by testing ostensibly bogus data. Namely, they took Bigfoot data and crunched it, and what it generated was a remarkably coherent distribution model based on various bioclimatic factors, which it turned out were remarkably, well, not surprisingly, but notably, let's use that word, notably similar in parallel to those for black bear. And again, no surprise, black bear have a large omnivore. They're going to have similarities in their diet and their needs for cover and shelter and so forth. So using those two, all these different things, kind of piecing them together, if you look at a map, they're not just reports may come from all 50 states, but not, or not 50 states, but maybe, have there been any reports from Hawaii? I don't know.
I don't think so yet.
But in any case,
Give that money some time.
It would be the big kahuna instead of Bigfoot, huh?
Yeah.
If you look at the distribution of black bear, current distribution of black bear across the United States, that I think is a pretty good rule of thumb. If a population of black bear can make a living, then it's likely that Sasquatch could as well. So if you look at that distribution, got a comment, Patrick?
Yeah, Patrick?
I always put my finger up so I don't step on anybody talking.
Yeah.
Well, when you start talking about habitat and ecology, it's diverse from where I'm at to Canada to Southern California to Florida, and studying primitive survival is part of the aspect I use to study these. And survival in Utah is much different than survival in Louisiana. You'll need a greater home range, in a more arid area than you here. Now, when you start talking about bear habitat, and that really is about what bears do. The ecology can support them, but does it mean that they fill it up?
Right.
Okay. So
Right.
You have an intelligent bipedal, and I say extremely intelligent, from what I've tracked and seen them do, that can make decisions, and I'm right there with you on a lot of points. As far as, does a male have this female here and that and another female 20, 30 miles away? That's always been a question of mine.
Mm-hmm.
But when the juvenile hit 5 years old, I noticed that he quit spending time with mom. He wasn't on mom's hip, he was on dad's. So he's running with dad, being trained with dad at that time. And at 5 years, you're talking about the how chimpanzees breed and how often that happens, being 6 years. Well, I mean, I think that kind of goes alongside of it. It was 5 years from the juvenile male's birth to the juvenile female's birth.
No. Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of it all lines up. And you were talking about the your nest that you dug into. I've found them.
Oh,
And the criteria that you discussed when you were talking about the area that it was in goes along with the criteria I use for the home sites and going along. And where I'll start my tracking at is behind a water barrier. That brook is a water barrier. And the elevation is for observation.
right.
And the thermals that will come up that ridgeline will also carry scent to the higher elevations. And they also use your rock roads against you.
Yeah.
They'll hear your conveyance coming,
Right.
and gives them a heads up.
Yeah.
So, and I just want to say thank you for coming on and sharing it. It's an honor to meet you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So anyway, the bottom line is, and I don't mean to say these are hard, fast criteria, but just painting a broad picture, recognizing that I mean, just as if you try to establish a home range for black bear, individuals, females versus males, I mean, it just depends on the resources available. I mean, they've clocked brown bear going hundreds of miles from one spot to another, with cubs in tow even sometimes. It's remarkable. And then others never move, like you were saying, more than 10 square miles, if that. And so, but in any case, what I try to do, just to get a handle, at least get a ballpark, and to help people, in my opinion, understand what I think is the rarity. I tend to the other direction. I don't think that there's more than people realize. I think there's much fewer than what people generally realize. But if you look at the state of Idaho, you look at where there's 18 plus inches of precipitation, and where black bear habitat is, how many, let's just say for the sake of the straw man here, how many 1,000 square mile plots could you fit in there roughly, allowing for variation in topography and patchiness of the habitat and so forth. And it's about 15 in the state of Idaho. And we've got more wilderness than any of the other lower 48. So 15, and if we take one male and say 3 females and a couple offspring, so there's 6. So let's make it 5. It's math's easier. 15 times 5 is 75. That's too conservative. Let's double it. There's 150, or let's go again. There's 300. There's 35,000 black bear estimated in Idaho. So you've got 300 versus 35,000. That kind of addresses questions like, well, why don't we find bodies? Why don't we find more nests? Why don't we find this or that? Why aren't there more encounters? I mean, I think that they're extremely rare. So you do that, repeat that process for Northern California, for Oregon, Washington, say, and in the Western United States, from the Great Plains over and up through the Canadian Rockies, I would put it at about 2,000, maybe 3,000 tops. In all of North America, certainly less than 5,000. I mean, you get over in those eastern states, British Columbia, 110,000 black bear. I don't know what the latest estimate. I always can't keep all the southern states straight, but Mississippi, I'd wager it's maybe about 5,000 black bear.
No, not even.
Not even?
No, not close.
Okay, less than that. There's a few over there, like what is it, South Carolina, or one of them has about 5,000.
Yeah, I mean,
have almost none.
The more closer you are in the Appalachian chain,
right,
really starts in North Georgia to North Carolina, Tennessee. So I don't know, Patrick, how many black bears are in your area?
Not many. We've imported them.
So it's very very rare.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's part of it. Our habitat will support them, but bear do what bear do, and that's their species. And I completely respect Dr. Meldrum's, take on it. There's no experts here. We don't know.
Yeah, this is a purely theoretical. I think it does kind of establish some parameters for for scale, for orders of magnitude.
I agree. Yeah.
But
yeah, there's not 10 million of them. We know that.
Well, I can definitely say that in my experience, I've tracked 24 of them around this area within 200 miles of me. Now, how that equates to population across the board nationwide, given what I know about the ecology, and the here is very rich. We have a lot of hog. We have a hog epidemic, and they love killing and eating hogs here.
Yeah.
I've tracked them. Killing hogs. I've tracked them. One was walking and was chewing on a deer jawbone and dropped it in its track. Okay. So I don't know how it equates. Like I said, none of us are experts, and I completely respect your take on it.
Well, likewise, yeah, no, and you're right. When there's a concentration of resource, there can be a blip in that, and that's it. They're not evenly distributed throughout the habitat. There's going to be patchiness to it. It's like I was working with a gentleman one time, and he was of the mindset, if you've got the resources, you've got the manpower, you got the plan, you get it done. And so we were going out to do a little preliminary survey work, but he kind of turns to me and says, "So Jeff, what do you think our odds are in this trip?" And I said, "Well, let's stop and buy a lotto ticket and we can discuss it a little more." I said, we can have everything work. We can have every bell and whistle that's reasonably available. We can be prepared to the hilt, and yet we're going to be working in one drainage. If the Sasquatch has gone over the ridge and he's in the adjacent drainage, there may be nothing. There may be nothing in this whole drainage. We'll spend our 2 weeks there, and we won't see any sign of anything. As the case turned out, it was the year of dreadful forest fires in central Idaho.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
We got chased out by the forced evacuation because of the fires. But anyway, the point is, that's why I'm really interested to follow up with you, Patrick, and see just what it is that you're seeing on such a regular basis. Because, I always tell people, I don't know of anyone who goes out and intentionally finds a Sasquatch and has an encounter.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I was a skeptic with a capital S. I didn't want to know anything.
Sure.
All right, my first encounter, I was chased for a mile out of the woods.
Oh.
And I didn't sleep for almost 2 years.
Huh.
Okay, it bothered me.
Uh-huh.
Now, I'm not a romantic that says, wow, I'm glad these things are here. I'm a primitive survivalist that's had to study them. So I could, the first thing I was doing is debunking them for my own sanity. The second thing is I had to learn how they use the land so I could use the land too, and avoid them and avoid competing with them, because I'm a firm believer that two species in the same area competing for the same resources can turn into a bad situation. And all that said, I've been a reluctant researcher, but I don't know how to do anything halfway. So I might as well jump in both feet and use all the skill sets I have tracking and understanding what they need as primitive survivalists to use what they need to affect their own survival in the landscape.
Yep.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've taken up too much of your time, Dr. Meldrum. I don't. You seem to be interested in what's going on. I can keep it going.
My wife won't let me though.
Yeah,
I've already gotten a couple messages.
All right. Well, we will wrap it up. Thanks for being here. I appreciate your time, man. We only dived into half of what I wanted to talk about, and these are the kind of discussions I want to have with professionals like yourself or even skeptics. Even with a capital S, bring them on. We can talk to these people. But thank you so much for being here. It was incredible discussion, and to bring the panel in and just kind of open it up and just get diverse about it. You know,
Yeah.
break the mold, man. Let's talk about this in a real way that other people can understand in a different way. So, glad to have you here. Glad to have the panel. We'll wrap it up. And yeah, I don't know. Yeah, let's go ahead and end the broadcast. We're 3 hours in. Thanks for being here, guys. Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum and the panel. We will hopefully we'll do this again someday and continue the discussion further. So to that, I will say
that would be great. That would be great. Thank you, Dr. Meldrum.
Thank you.